Yo, what's up everyone? It's The Fiction Wizard, and today we're checking out Xenophilius Lovegood printed Harry's medical file on the Quibbler's front page. Every owl knew by noon. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1. The morning the owls came. The dream always ended the same way. Not with Voldemort. Not with the green light or the forest or the cold marble floor of the great hall where Fred Weasley lay with his face turned to the side like he'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of a war. Those dreams came too, but the one that woke Harry most often was quieter than all of that. It was just a corridor. Long and grey, the kind that existed in every magical building ever constructed, as though architects of the wizarding world had collectively decided that atmosphere mattered more than efficiency. And at the end of the corridor there was a door, and behind the door was a sound, and the sound was his own name spoken in a voice he could never quite identify before he woke. He woke now to birds. Specifically, to the particular chaos that erupted whenever more than 3 owls tried to use the burrow's kitchen window at the same time. It was a sound Harry had come to know over the years, a kind of aggressive feathered argument, all ruffled indignation and competing wing beats. But this morning it was louder than usual, and it kept going, and when he lay there in the dark of the small bedroom that the Weasleys had given him without ceremony or condition, he realized it wasn't stopping because there weren't 3 owls. There were many. He lay there for a moment longer. Through the thin wall he could hear Ginny's voice, then Molly's, higher and sharper. Somewhere below, something fell off a shelf. He heard the distinctive sound of Ron swearing in the particular tone that meant he'd been hit with something and was trying not to let his mum know. Harry got up. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt that had once been Dudley's and was now just his, in the way that things became yours when you wore them long enough, and he pushed open the bedroom door and stepped into the upstairs corridor of the burrow. The noise was coming from below and from outside simultaneously. He could hear it from the stairwell, that particular press of wings against glass, the demanding clicks and hoots that meant letters. Letters urgent enough that their senders had paid for overnight delivery, or early delivery, or whatever the wizarding postal equivalent was of this cannot wait. He came down the stairs to find Molly standing in the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed flat against the frame as if bracing herself against something structural. The windows were dark with birds. Not an exaggeration. The glass was actually dimmed by them, the morning light coming through in fractured patches where wings shifted and moved. There had to be 40 owls. 50. He stopped counting. Ron was at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, which meant he hadn't slept, which meant he'd been up with George again. He was holding a copy of something and his face had a particular quality to it that Harry recognized, the careful blankness that Ron used when he was working out how angry he was allowed to be before he understood the full situation. "What is it?" Harry said. Ron looked up. He put the paper face down on the table with a single clean movement that answered the question more clearly than any words. "Harry," Molly said, turning around, and her voice did a thing that voices did sometimes when the person speaking them had spent the last 90 seconds deciding what they were going to say and had still not quite managed it. "What is it?" Harry said again. Not a question this time. Hermione appeared from behind Molly, stepping through from the garden door with her hair undone and a copy of the Quibbler in her hand. She was wearing her dressing gown, which meant she'd seen it and had come directly from wherever she'd been sleeping, the de Havilland spare room that the Weasleys had quietly repurposed since the war, close enough to the burrow to walk the garden path in under 2 minutes. She was looking at Harry with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. She held out the Quibbler. He took it. The front page was, well. The front page was what it was, and Harry read it once, quickly, the way you read things when you're standing up and expect to put the paper down in a moment. Then he read it again, slower, the way you read things when you're standing very still and have realized that putting the paper down is not going to make the words in it cease to exist. Potter's Secret Suffering, the complete medical record. The Quibbler can today exclusively reveal the full clinical history of Harry James Potter as documented by the healers of St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries over a period of 7 years. The file, obtained by this publication through sources it is not able to reveal at this time, paints a picture of systematic injury, chronic curse damage, and psychological evaluation that the wizarding world's most famous hero has never disclosed to the public that loves him. He stopped reading the introduction. He moved to the columns below it. The file was reproduced in full. He could see his own name at the top of the first column, the St. Mungo's patient registration number he hadn't known he had, the date of his first admission, which was 1992, second year, the Chamber of Secrets, basilisk venom, and below it the careful clinical handwriting of healers who had never expected their notes to be read by anyone except other healers. That was what made it, not worse, exactly, but different from the other kinds of public exposure Harry had experienced. The prophet had printed lies about him. Rita Skeeter had invented a version of him and sold it. This was not invented. This was the precise, technical, compassionless vocabulary of medicine applied to the specific reality of his body. Patient presents with residual basilisk venom markers in bloodstream, neutralized but not eliminated. Long-term prognosis unclear. Scarring from cruciatus exposure, early indication at 14, secondary assessment at 17. Pattern consistent with repeated and extended application. Not isolated incident. Psychological evaluation requested by attending healer, declined by patient. Patient declines. Patient declines again. He read that part 3 times without meaning to. The owls were still at the windows. They've been arriving since 5, Hermione said. She'd moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could see she was reading the page he was on from her peripheral vision, checking where he was in it, adjusting. Some of them are press. Some are members of the public. Some are from the ministry. Kingsley? Harry said. 1 is from Kingsley, yes. And 2 are from his department heads. And 1 is from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Did you read it? Harry asked, and he looked at her properly, and she met his eyes without flinching. Yes, she said. I'm sorry. Don't, he said. Not unkindly. She closed her mouth. He turned to the next column. The notes from his 4th year, the return of Voldemort, the graveyard, the curse damage they documented when he'd arrived at St. Mungo's afterward under circumstances he barely remembered. He hadn't known half of what they'd written. Some of it he was reading for the first time in this format, on a kitchen table in the burrow, in someone else's family home, surrounded by people who loved him and were now in the position of having accidentally learned things about him that he had never chosen to share. He turned the page. 5th year. 6th year. The notes became more frequent. There were psychological evaluations after the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. Patient demonstrates hypervigilance consistent with prolonged traumatic exposure. Patient demonstrates dissociative responses under pressure. Patient demonstrates, and he turned that page more quickly than the others. The 7th year section was the longest. The healers had been thorough. Someone on the staff at St. Mungo's had been very thorough indeed. The Horcrux notation was there. The clinical notes about what the piece of Voldemort's soul living inside him for 17 years had done to his magical signature, his nervous system, his baseline responses to external magical stimuli. He hadn't fully understood those notes when the healer had explained them to him, but here they were laid out in plain print with section headings and subclauses, and the owls were still arriving. Harry, Ron said, from the table. His voice was doing something it almost never did. It was careful. Mate. How many copies went out? Harry said. Hermione made a small sound. It was a full print run. Standard Quibbler distribution. Which is how many? About 12,000 copies. The number sat in the kitchen for a moment. Plus, Hermione said, and he could hear her choosing the word with precision, the Prophet has already run a response piece on their website, the magical equivalent. So whatever was in the file has now been quoted, re-excerpted, and editorially commented on by a second publication with a circulation of approximately 140,000. Harry put the paper down on the table. He didn't slam it. He just set it down, flat, front page up, Xenophilius Lovegood's byline facing the ceiling. "The owls want responses," Molly said, from the doorway. Her voice was controlled in the way that Molly Weasley's voice got controlled when she was suppressing something large enough to do structural damage if released indoors. Some of the senders are quite insistent. There's a representative from the Wisengamot who wants a statement. There's a healer from St. Mungo's who wants to apologize, I think, or explain. It's somewhat hard to tell from the letter. And she paused. There's a journalist from Witch Weekly. No, Harry said. Of course not, no, Molly agreed, immediately. I need coffee, Harry said. He moved to the kitchen, stepped around Hermione, and put the kettle on, because the kettle at the burrow was non-magical and required someone to actually fill it and light the hob, and doing those two things with his hands gave him something to do with his body while his mind did what it needed to do. He heard the chairs scrape as Ron and Hermione sat down. He heard Molly move to the garden window, not to let the owls in, he understood, but to stand with her back to the room for a moment, which was Molly's version of the same thing he was doing with the kettle. It's Xenophilius, Harry said, once the water was running. Yes, Hermione said. Where did he get the file? We don't know. That's actually the more concerning part, in some respects. St. Mungo's medical records are protected under the healer's oath. They're magically sealed, legally designated as private property of the patient. For someone to have obtained that file, they either had access they shouldn't have had, or they bribed someone with that access, or someone gave it to Zeno, Ron said. Someone who wanted it printed. There was a beat. Yes, Hermione said. That's the third option. Harry finished filling the kettle and set it on the hob. The morning light through the kitchen window was soft and golden, the kind that came in at a low angle in August, and the owls' shadows moved across it in shifting shapes. He watched them for a moment. "Ginny's still upstairs?" he asked. "She's coming down," Molly said, without turning around. Harry nodded. He thought about what he'd just read, not the specific contents, not the clinical language with its careful, detached accounting of things that had happened to him, but the fact of it. The fact of those pages existing in the world now, in the hands of 12,000 people who had subscribed to the Quibbler because they trusted Xenophilius Lovegood, or because they'd once liked his unusual perspective on rotfangs and nargles, or because after the war he'd seemed like a man who'd suffered and then recovered, a man whose daughter had helped them win and who deserved some grace. Harry had been one of the people who'd thought that. He heard Ginny's footsteps on the stairs, a distinctive pattern, a second-to-last step skip she'd had since she was small, a habit she'd never lost, and then she was in the kitchen doorway. She had read it already, he could see that. She'd either read it upstairs or Hermione had told her, or she'd heard the owls and guessed enough to go find a copy before she came down. Her expression was tight and focused and not unlike the expression she wore on a Quidditch pitch when something was about to happen that she had decided she was going to control. She looked at him for one long moment. "Tell me what you need," she said. It was exactly the right thing to say, and he thought that was one of the things he loved about her, not that she always found the right words, but that she had a specific radar for when the wrong ones were the wrong ones. "No, how are you?" "No, I'm so sorry." No version of anything that made him the object of her feelings about his situation rather than a person in his own situation. "I need to know how this happened," he said. "And then I need to do something about it." "Right," she said, and came into the kitchen. The kettle began to boil. Ron was already at the table with a parchment and a quill, which was either a sign that he'd anticipated this conversation or that he'd been writing something before Harry came down, probably a letter to George, Harry thought, which he'd stopped writing when he heard the owls. Hermione had opened her bag, which lived at the Burrow now almost as permanently as she did, and was pulling out the kind of organized folder that meant she'd either anticipated this specific scenario or was the kind of person who could reorganize in under 4 minutes, and Harry had long since concluded it was probably both. St. Mungo's has a records office on the 2nd floor, Hermione said, spreading parchment on the table. Patient files are kept in a physically separate wing under Fidelius-adjacent charms. They're not quite Fidelius, but they're similar. The information can only be accessed by authorized staff and the patient themselves. Which means either a member of staff copied the file and passed it on, or someone forged Harry's authorization, or the charm was broken, Harry said. Broken charms don't leave the information looking this pristine, Hermione said. If the charm had been broken, the file would have been fragmented, at least partially illegible. This is a complete, clean reproduction. She paused. Someone on the inside. Harry brought the coffee to the table, 4 mugs, Molly's preferred blend, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and sat down. The paper was still on the table, face up. He didn't move it. Xenophilius knows who his source is, Harry said. He won't reveal them, Hermione said. Press protection. It's not the same as solicitor-client privilege, but in practice, I'm not asking him to reveal them, Harry said. I'm asking him directly. The table was quiet for a moment. You're going to go to Zeno, Ron said. Not a question. Today, Harry said. He lives in Devon, Hermione said. About 40 minutes by apparition from here if you go in 2 hops. I know where he lives, Harry said. He'd been there in 7th year. He still remembered the way the lane curved, the tower visible above the hedgerows, the particular feeling of that night, the sound of the locket against his chest, Hermione's hand on his arm, Ron's jaw set the way it set when he was terrified and decided not to show it. He remembered the look on Xenophilius's face when he'd sent the Patronus to alert the Death Eaters. The desperate calculation of a man who had weighed his daughter's life against his principles and made the only choice he could. Harry had understood that choice then. He still understood it. Understanding it didn't mean it hadn't happened. I want to see the file first, he said. The full thing. Properly. Hermione nodded and reached across the table to turn the Quibbler to the appropriate pages. Ron shifted his chair slightly, making room, and the 3 of them leaned in together the way they had leaned in over maps and books and plans in 100 difficult rooms over the last 7 years, and Harry read his own medical history in a published newspaper while the owls cooed at the windows of the Burrow and the morning came in through the kitchen glass in long, golden strips. It took an hour. Not because the reading took that long but because after the reading came a silence, and the silence needed to be what it was before anything else happened. Hermione had her hands flat on the table. Ron was looking at the grain of the wood. Harry was looking at the last page of the file, the final entry, dated 3 weeks after the Battle of Hogwarts, a follow-up appointment he'd attended alone and not mentioned to anyone, in which the attending healer had written in neat, measured script, "Patient continues to decline psychological support. Physical recovery proceeding normally. Recommend continued monitoring. Note, patient exhibits minimal emotional response to clinical discussion of his history. This may indicate dissociation or may indicate coping strategy of functional suppression. Unclear which." He wondered what the healer's name was. He'd never asked. It seemed suddenly important that he hadn't asked. "The Horcrux section," Hermione said, finally. "I didn't, Harry, I didn't know about the nerve damage." "Neither did I," he said. "Not in those exact terms." "It says it's minimal," she said. "And improving." He said. "Harry, I'm not going to tell you I'm fine," he said. "I'm also not going to tell you I'm not fine. I don't think either of those things is accurate. I think what's accurate is that someone printed my medical file in a newspaper, and that's a thing that happened to me, and I'd like to do something about it before I decide how I feel about everything in those pages." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "What do you need from me specifically?" Legal framework, he said. What are my actual options? She sat forward. Right. Under the Wizarding Medical Privacy Act of 1812, as amended in 1943, a patient's records are their property in a legally binding sense. Publication without consent is a criminal offense, not just a civil one, a criminal one. Maximum penalty is 6 months in Azkaban and a significant fine, though historically prosecutions have been rare because most cases involve minor disclosures rather than, she gestured at the paper, rather than this. So I can press charges, Harry said. Against Xenophilius, yes. Potentially against the source within St. Mungo's as well, depending on whether they can be identified. And against anyone who reproduced the content without, so, the profit, as well. What about the ministry official possibility? Ron said, and they both looked at him. He shrugged. Someone might have got the file to give to Zeno. If that someone is in the ministry, that's not just a medical privacy issue, that's a, what is that? Abuse of position? Misconduct in public office, Hermione said, and something sharpened in her expression. Yes. If a ministry official was involved in obtaining or distributing a patient's confidential medical file, that would be, yes, Ron, that would be considerably more serious. We don't know that yet, Harry said. No, she agreed. But it's worth knowing. Harry drained the last of his coffee, which had gone cold while he'd been reading. He stood up, pushed his chair back. Through the window, the owls were finally thinning. Some of them had given up and left, unable to compete for perch space, taking their letters back to their senders with the particular offended air that owls wore when a delivery had been declined. A few persistent ones remained, regarding Harry with bright, intelligent eyes. I need to go to St. Mungo's first, he said. Before Zeno. I want to look them in the eye. I'm coming with you, Hermione said. So am I, said Ron. You don't, Harry, Ginny said from her place at the kitchen counter, where she'd been eating toast with the focused calm of someone who had decided that someone in this room should be eating toast. Don't say you don't have to come. They know that. A beat. Sorry, Harry said. Don't apologize either, she said. Just tell them what time you're leaving. 10:30, he said. I'll be here, she said, and put her mug in the sink. The owls came again at 9:30. Harry was upstairs changing when he heard Molly deal with them, a series of muffled exchanges, her voice rising briefly before settling, and then the sound of the kitchen door closing with the particular force that Molly reserved for moments when she had been forced to speak firmly to someone or something and wanted the architecture to know about it. He was buttoning his shirt, not robes, just jeans and a dark green shirt. He hadn't worn robes since the war except when he absolutely had to, when he heard a tap at the bedroom door. It was Arthur. Harry hadn't seen him yet that morning. Arthur Weasley had the quality of a man who gave you space when you needed space, not out of indifference but out of a particular kind of attention. He observed what was needed and provided it without commentary. He stood in the doorway now with a copy of the Quibbler in one hand and the expression of a man who had spent a career at the ministry watching institutions make mistakes and who had never quite got used to it. I just wanted you to know, Arthur said, that whatever you decide to do, you have the full support of everyone in this house. I mean that practically as well as, you know. As a sentiment. Thank you, Harry said. Arthur nodded. He looked at the paper in his hand, then back at Harry. I worked with Xenophilius, you know. Briefly. After the war started, before things got bad. He was a good editor once. Genuinely. The Quibbler was a better publication when it was just strange. When it started being brave. He paused. I don't know what happened to him in the last year. Luna's been away since June. I think he's been alone. That doesn't make it right, Harry said. No, Arthur said, immediately. It doesn't. I'm not suggesting it does. He stopped. I suppose I'm just not sure he understood what he was doing. And I'm not sure whether that makes it better or worse. Harry considered this. It makes it more complicated, he said, finally. Which is different from better or worse. Arthur looked at him for a moment with an expression that Harry couldn't quite read, something warm and something sad and something that might, if he was reading it right, have been a species of quiet pride. Yes, he said. That's right. He stepped back from the door. Molly is making sandwiches for the journey. She knows you don't need them. I'm afraid there's nothing to be done about that. Harry almost smiled. I'll take them. Good man, Arthur said, and disappeared down the corridor. 10:30 came. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood in the Burrows' garden. The garden in August was the garden it had always been. The gnomes were somewhere in the far beds doing whatever gnomes did when not being degnomed. The grass was long and slightly crooked in the way that magical gardens tended toward when the family tending them had, recently, more pressing concerns. The apple tree at the edge of the plot still had a rope swing on it from a summer years ago. Harry had sat in that swing at 15, at 16, in the stretched golden days between Hogwarts terms when being here had felt like the closest thing to safe he'd found anywhere. He stood in the garden and felt the morning around him and thought about the words on those pages, the healer's clean clinical handwriting made foreign by being printed, by being distributed, by being read over breakfast tables and on morning trains and in office break rooms by 140,000 people who had never been in a room with Harry Potter but now knew things about him that his closest friends had not. Patient declines. Patient declines again. He had said no. He had said it clearly. And someone had printed his no alongside everything else, as if his no was simply another data point rather than a boundary he had the right to draw. Ready? Hermione said. He turned to face her. Yes. They operated together, Harry and Hermione, then Ron a second behind, the three distinct cracks overlapping in the quiet August air, and the Burrow garden disappeared, and London arrived around them in the particular compact way it had when you landed near Charing Cross, the Muggle city humming around the edges of the magical one, and Harry stood for one moment with the city at his back and his hands empty at his sides. He was not frightened. He was not overwhelmed. He was something he'd been growing into since May, since the war had ended and the world had kept moving, and he'd found, underneath all the noise of victory and grief and celebration, a very clear and uncomplicated sense of himself. He was Harry Potter, and someone had printed his medical file in a newspaper, and he was going to find out how it happened, and he was going to make certain it never happened again, and he was not going to do it quietly or privately or in a way that could be later described as managed or handled or contained. He was going to do it as himself. St. Mungo's, he said. And he walked through the door. Chapter 2, What the File said. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries occupied a building on Purge and Dow's Ltd. that had always struck Harry as existing in a slightly different relationship with reality than the buildings on either side of it. The mannequin in the window had a different expression every time he visited. Today it was something between apologetic and determined, which felt appropriate. He muttered the password to the glass, felt the familiar give of the enchanted surface, and stepped through. The welcome witch at the front desk recognized him immediately. She was a young woman he didn't know, and the recognition moved across her face in a particular sequence he'd become very familiar with over the last 3 months, the initial startle, the brief instinct to say something, and then the conscious override as she remembered whatever professional training she'd received. She managed it well. Better than most. Mr. Potter, she said. How can I help you? I need to speak with whoever is in charge of patient records, Harry said. The head of records, or the hospital administrator, or whoever made the decision to speak to the Quibbler. Whoever that was. The welcome witch blinked. I'm not sure that I'm not angry at you specifically, Harry said, which was true. But I need to speak to someone senior in the next 10 minutes, or I'm going to have to come back with my solicitor, and that will take longer and be less pleasant for everyone. Including you, probably, because you'll have to manage the waiting room while that happens. Behind him, he heard Hermione make a small sound that might have been approval. The welcome witch picked up her communication mirror and spoke quietly into it. Harry turned to look at the atrium while she did. It was early enough that the ward traffic hadn't fully built yet, a few healers crossing the floor with the particular purposeful stride of people whose time was not their own, a family in the corner with the expressions that families got in hospital waiting rooms, a small boy with his arm in a sling who was examining Harry with the frank open curiosity of children who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. Harry looked back at him. The boy didn't look away. "You're Harry Potter," the boy said. "Yeah," Harry said. "My mum says you died," the boy said, with the tone of someone who found this both interesting and slightly suspicious. "I came back," Harry said. "Like a infurious?" "More like a decision," Harry said. The boy considered this seriously. "Cool," he said, and went back to examining his sling. A door opened on the far side of the atrium and a man came through it at speed, 50s, gray-streaked hair, healer's robes that were slightly too formal for this time of morning, which meant he'd put them on quickly rather than arrived wearing them. His name tag said Healer Administrator C. Brightwell. He had the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had been dreading it since approximately 5 that morning. "Mr. Potter," he said, and extended a hand. Harry shook it. "Cornelius Brightwell, Hospital Administrator. We've been expecting to hear from you. I want to say, on behalf of St. Mungo's and its entire, I don't need an apology yet," Harry said. "I need information. Can we do this somewhere that isn't the middle of the atrium?" Brightwell blinked. "Of course. Yes. Please, follow me." The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor, past the spell damage ward, through a corridor that Harry had walked twice before under circumstances he'd rather not think about with people whose absence still felt like a weight in the chest. He did not look at the ward names as he passed them. He looked at the corridor, and he walked. Brightwell's office was a large room with too much furniture and not enough natural light. He had maps of the hospital on one wall and a collection of glass paperweights on his desk that suggested either a hobby or a nervous habit or both. He gestured at the chairs in front of the desk, 3 of them, already arranged, which meant someone had told him Harry would not be coming alone, which meant someone in this building had been watching. Harry sat. Hermione and Ron sat on either side of him. Hermione had already taken out her notebook. "The file," Harry said. Brightwell opened his hands on his desk. "Mr. Potter. I want to be completely transparent with you. The breach, the specific mechanism of the breach, was discovered by our record security team at approximately 6:40 this morning, approximately 40 minutes after the first copies of the Quibbler were distributed. I can tell you what we know." "Tell me," Harry said. "The file was accessed 3 days ago," Brightwell said. "Digitally, magically, I should say. The access records show an authorized staff login, a senior records administrator who has worked here for 11 years. When we spoke to her this morning, she was..." He paused. "She was not able to account for the access. She said she had no memory of accessing your file, which we found, memory charm," Hermione said, not looking up from her notebook. Brightwell looked at her. "That is our current working theory, yes. Someone obliviated a hospital employee to cover a file theft," Ron said. "That's not just a records breach. That's assault." "Yes," Brightwell said, and the word had weight in it. "We have referred the matter to the DMLE already." "Who else had access?" Harry said. "Not through her specifically, I mean, who else in this building could access patient records legitimately? I need to know the ceiling. How many people?" "Authorized records staff, 12. Plus senior healers assigned to a given patient's case, in your case that was your attending healer, Healer Nakamura, and 2 junior healers on rotation. And the hospital administrator." He paused. "And the ministry liaison." The room shifted slightly. "St. Mungo's has a ministry liaison?" Hermione said. "All magical hospitals maintain a liaison officer for coordination with the Department of Magical Health and Safety," Brightwell said. It's procedural. The liaison doesn't normally have access to individual patient files, their role is operational, budgetary, but do they have clearance? Harry said. Technically. On paper. Do they have the level of clearance that could get them into patient records if they wanted to? Brightwell's expression did something complicated. Technically, he said, yes. The liaison clearance level covers emergency access to patient records in the event of a public health scenario. And who is the current ministry liaison to St. Mungo's? Hermione said. Brightwell shifted in his seat. An official named Aldous Crouch. Hermione wrote the name down. Harry watched her write it. Then he looked back at Brightwell. I want two things from you, he said. First, I want a full copy of your access records, who accessed my file, when, and from where. Second, I want a meeting with Healer Nakamura. The access records I can provide under your patient rights, Brightwell said. The meeting with Healer Nakamura, I can facilitate that, if she's agreeable. She's in the building. I believe she wants to speak with you. Good, Harry said. He stood. I also want to say something for the record, Mr. Brightwell. I don't think this is St. Mungo's fault in the way that the Quibbler has made it seem. I think someone used your institution. But I think you should know that the person who did it is still connected to your hospital through that liaison role, and I'd suggest thinking carefully about whether that connection should continue. Brightwell looked at him steadily. That is being considered as of this morning, he said. Right, Harry said. Thank you for your time. Healer Nakamura found them in the corridor outside Brightwell's office before the administrator had even had time to facilitate anything. She was a small woman in her 40s with neat black hair and the kind of posture that came from years of standing over beds where very bad things had happened and maintaining composure anyway. She had clearly been waiting for them. Mr. Potter, she said. Healer Nakamura, Harry said. She looked at him with a directness that he appreciated. No performance. No layered professional effect. She looked like a person who was angry and who had decided to be professionally honest about being angry. I want you to know that I have maintained your confidentiality through every interaction I have had since the breach was discovered. I have not confirmed, denied, clarified, or elaborated on anything in that file to any journalist, ministry official, or member of the public. I will continue to do so. I know, Harry said. Your notes were the ones I was they were the most careful. Something moved through her expression. You've read the file. The published version. I see. She paused. I want you to know there are things in that file that would have been worded differently had I imagined for a single moment that they would be read outside a clinical context. Not because I was incorrect, but because clinical language does a kind of violence to lived experience when it's printed in. She stopped herself. Professionally. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry for doing your job accurately, Harry said. She nodded. I wanted to say in person, the recommendation for psychological support. I know you declined. Several times. She met his eyes. I want you to know the offer remains standing. Whenever you're ready. Or never, if never is what you choose. But it's there. Harry looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. And he meant it. She gave him a small nod, precise and warm at once, and walked back down the corridor the way she'd come. Ron waited until she'd turned the corner. She seems good, he said. Yeah, Harry said. She's right about the language, Hermione said. She was still looking at her notebook, but her voice had gone quiet. Clinical language in public it strips context. It makes you sound like a subject rather than a person. That's what it felt like, Harry said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out as simply as a sentence about the weather, and once it was out he didn't pull it back. He just kept walking down the corridor toward the lift, and Hermione and Ron fell into step beside him, and nobody said anything, because sometimes the right response to someone saying a true thing quietly was to walk alongside it. In the lift, going down, Hermione said, "Aldous Crouch. You already know something about him," Harry said. "I know of him," she said. "He's been in the ministry for about 12 years. Started in the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, fairly junior, nothing remarkable. Moved to Department of Magical Health and Safety about 5 years ago, which is where he picked up the St. Mungo's liaison role. He gave evidence at 2 Wisengamot hearings after the war, both related to the reconstruction of ministry protocols. He argued both times for stronger centralized oversight of public institutions. He was politely rebuffed both times by Kingsley's team. Which means he disagrees with how Kingsley runs things," Ron said. "More than that," Hermione said. "His argument in both hearings was specific. He thinks Kingsley's administration is too loose. Too dependent on trust and personal relationships rather than formal structure. He wants oversight mechanisms. Audit committees. Control systems." "Which sounds reasonable," Harry said. "In principle, yes," Hermione said. "But the way he argued it, the Wisengamot transcripts are public record, I read them before the war, they came up in my ministry research. He was quite pointed about the way that personal loyalty to the hero narrative had distorted institutional decision-making. He specifically mentioned you. Not by name in the transcript, he called you the symbolic figure central to the current administration's public legitimacy." "Charming," Ron said. "He's not wrong, exactly," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. "I'm not saying I agree with his methods. I'm saying that if his argument is that Kingsley's ministry is too reliant on me as a symbol, that's not a stupid thing to notice. It's a real problem." Harry paused. Which might be why he thought destabilizing that symbol would be useful. It's not random. It's targeted. The lift doors opened on the ground floor. The atrium was busier now, mid-morning traffic, people arriving for appointments, the familiar smell of magical hospitals that was different from Muggle ones in ways Harry had never quite been able to identify but always recognized. He crossed the atrium without slowing. "So we have a ministry official who disagrees with Kingsley's approach to governance," he said, "who had legitimate access to my medical file through a clearance level that covers emergency situations, and who appears to have either accessed that file himself or arranged for someone to do so, and then fed it to Xenophilius Lovegood, knowing that Zeno is in a vulnerable position post-war and desperate to rebuild his publication's credibility." "That's a working theory," Hermione said carefully. "It's a very good working theory," Harry said, pushing through the front entrance into the sharp morning air of the Charing Cross Road, London swirling around them, double-decker buses and tourists and black cabs, and below it all the invisible hum of the magical world doing its business behind its 100 hidden surfaces. "And if it's correct, then Xenophilius Lovegood was used." "Zeno still published it," Ron said, not unkindly. "Yes," Harry said. "He did. And he's going to have to account for that. But there's a difference between a man who did something wrong and a man who was set up to do something wrong by someone who understood exactly what he'd do." He stopped at the corner of the street. 2 different conversations. 2 different problems. "You're going to go easier on Zeno than he deserves," Ron said. Harry looked at him. "I'm going to go exactly as hard on Zeno as is appropriate," he said. "And I'm going to go considerably harder on Aldous Crouch." Ron held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." They went back to the Burrow for lunch, because Molly had made it clear without saying anything directly that lunch would be available and that not appearing for it would cause her a quiet distress she would not express and everyone would have to manage. Harry understood this and didn't resent it. He sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup that appeared in front of him and answered Arthur's careful questions about St. Mungo's and watched the afternoon light move across the kitchen walls. Ginny sat across from him. She'd been out that morning, Quidditch training, which was starting again with the Holyhead Harpies pre-season, which she'd rejoined 2 months ago because she was, as she had stated with characteristic clarity, not going to spend the rest of her life not playing Quidditch just because a war had interrupted it. She came in still slightly wind-burned, her hair tied back, and sat across from Harry and poured herself soup and didn't ask him how St. Mungo's had gone. "Ginny," he said. She looked up. "It was fine," he said. "We got what we needed." She nodded. "Good." "Aldous Crouch," Hermione said, to the table generally. "I've been thinking about what we have and don't have. What we have is circumstantial. Strong circumstantial, access, motive, opportunity. What we don't have is anything direct. We don't have proof he was in that file, we don't have a communication trail between him and Xenophilius, and we don't have the obliviated records administrator's memory back, which is probably the most important piece." "Can her memory be restored?" Arthur asked. "Possibly. Depending on who cast it and how. Some obliviations can be reversed, some can't. The DMLE will try if the case goes there." She put down her spoon. "But here's the thing. If we go straight to Kingsley with what we have now, we risk Crouch knowing before we're ready. He's inside the ministry. He'll hear it through the internal communication system before any formal investigation is opened. So we build the case ourselves first," Harry said. "That's one option," Hermione said. "But there's a more elegant one." They all looked at her. "Xenophilius," she said. "If Zeno was used, if someone gave him that file with the specific intention of having him publish it, then Zeno has information we need. He knows who his source was. He may not have realized who he was really dealing with, but he knows what they looked like, what they said, how the transaction happened. He's not an accessory in the criminal sense, he's also a victim of this, in a way. And a victim who can be persuaded to help is considerably more useful than a suspect who can be prosecuted." "You want him to testify," Harry said. "I want him to cooperate," she said. "Which is different, and potentially more powerful depending on how this goes." The kitchen was quiet for a moment except for the sounds of soup and the distant bickering of gnomes in the garden. "I still want to go see him today," Harry said. "I know," she said. "And I think you should. I just want you to think about what you want from that conversation before you walk in." "I want to look him in the face," Harry said. "And then?" He thought about the pages he'd read that morning. The clinical handwriting. Patient declines. Patient declines again. He thought about 12,000 copies going out with the Dawn Owls, his private history distributed like a chocolate frog card. He thought about a man in a tower in Devon who had once sent a Patronus to betray him and had once sheltered him and had once been a good editor and who was now whatever he had become, alone, without Luna, with a newspaper no one trusted and a guilt he'd been quietly drowning in since the night his daughter had walked back through his door alive. "I want to understand," Harry said. "And I want him to understand. The actual size of what he did. Not a legal version of it. The real version." Ginny was watching him from across the table. Her expression was quiet and focused. "Be careful with that," she said. "Careful how?" "Careful that making him understand doesn't become you carrying his feelings about it for him," she said. "You don't owe him that." Harry looked at her. She held his gaze easily, the way she always did, not a challenge, just a refusal to look away from the thing she'd just said. "No," he said, slowly. "I don't." "Okay," she said, and picked up her soup again. They left at 3. Harry had spent the 2 hours after lunch at the kitchen table with Hermione and Arthur, going through the access records that Brightwell had sent by owl, a thick roll of parchment with the St. Mungo's seal across the top, already slightly formal in the way that official documents became when someone knew they were going to be examined carefully. The records were detailed. 3 days ago, at 11:47 in the evening, the records administrator's login had been used to access Harry's file. The physical access log showed no one in the records wing at that time. The door entry charm had not registered an entry. "Remote access," Hermione said. Someone with the administrator's login credentials used them from outside the building. Crouch, Ron said. Someone with access to her credentials, at minimum. Which either means she gave them up voluntarily, which she says she didn't, or someone extracted them from her, either through the obliviation or before it. Hermione paused. Actually, the obliviation might not have been to make her forget the access. It might have been to make her forget giving someone her credentials. So he might not have even done the access himself, Harry said. He might have used her to do it, then made her forget. That would keep him completely off the paper trail. She looked at the records again. His own login wasn't used. Whatever this was, he was careful. Careful people get caught, Harry said. They just get caught differently. He rolled the parchment up and tucked it inside his jacket. Arthur gave him a look that was partly concerned and partly, Harry thought, something like recognition. Arthur had spent 30 years watching institutions from the inside, watching the ways that careful people did careful damage. He knew the texture of it. "Give my regards to Xenophilius," Arthur said. "You mean that sincerely?" Harry said, slightly surprised. "I do," Arthur said. "He's had a very hard time." "That doesn't excuse anything." "But it's true." Harry nodded. He went to get his jacket. Outside, in the garden, before they apparat, Ginny caught his sleeve. Not hard, just enough to make him stop and turn. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Then, come back and tell me how it goes." "I will." "Don't," she stopped. "Don't come back pretending it went differently than it did. If it's hard, come back and say it was hard." He looked at her for a moment in the afternoon light. August in the Burrows' garden. The gnomes were quiet for once. Somewhere inside, Molly was doing something in the kitchen that involved rhythmic chopping, and the sound of it was domestic and ordinary and safe. "I don't do that with you," he said. "No," she said. "You're getting better at not doing it. I just wanted to say it, because you're about to go have a conversation that, I just wanted to say it." He reached out and took her hand briefly, squeezed it once, let it go. "I'll come back and tell you exactly how it went," he said. "Even if it's complicated." "Especially if," she said. He smiled, a small one, real, the kind that came from somewhere below the surface, and turned back to where Hermione and Ron were waiting. "Ready," he said. They apparat. They came down in the lane outside Xenophilius's tower. The hedgerows were high and slightly overgrown, the same as Harry remembered, the same crookedness to the lane, the same sense of a property that had been built by someone who had very specific ideas about how space should feel and had not particularly consulted the surrounding landscape. The tower was visible above the hedgeline, weather-vaned and odd-angled, the Quibbler sunflower logo painted on a sign by the gate that was faded now and slightly warped at one corner. The gate was open. Harry walked through it. Hermione and Ron followed. The front door was also open. Not ajar, fully open, standing wide in the afternoon air. From inside came the sound of movement. Not frantic, not industrious. The specific sound of a person moving around their own home with the deliberate slowness of someone who has been sitting still for a long time and has only recently decided to move. Harry stepped up to the open door and knocked on the frame. The movement stopped. A moment passed. Then Xenophilius Lovegood appeared at the end of the entrance hallway, looking exactly like himself, the radish earrings, the slightly too large robes, the wild silver hair, and also nothing like the man Harry had last seen in this house. He was thinner. His eyes had the quality that eyes sometimes got when a person had not been sleeping enough or laughing enough, a slightly overlit, overdetermined look, like a gas flame turned higher than it needed to be to compensate for something. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "I suppose," Xenophilius said, after a long moment, "that you had better come in." "Yes," Harry said. "I'd better." He stepped through the door and into the house, and behind him Hermione and Ron came in, and the afternoon sun came in with them through the open door, and somewhere in the high rooms of the tower above them, the press that had printed 12,000 copies of Harry's private history sat waiting in the silence. And Harry walked toward whatever this conversation was going to be with both hands open and his eyes clear and his mind already reaching past anger towards something harder and more useful. Answers. He was here for answers. And then he was here to decide what came next. Chapter 3, Zeno's bargain. The inside of the tower was simultaneously exactly as Harry remembered it and completely different, in the way that places were different when the person who inhabited them had changed. The furniture was the same, the mismatched chairs, the tables covered in back issues and printing equipment and the particular archaeological strata of a man who lived alone with his work. The walls still had the same Quibbler covers pinned to them, the same photographs, the same strange diagrams charting the movements of creatures that may or may not have existed. But the energy was different. Where it had once felt frenetic, the barely contained chaos of a mind that moved faster than its surroundings, it now felt still. The kind of still that wasn't peaceful. The kind that came after movement had stopped. The photographs, Harry noticed. Luna's face was everywhere. Not one or two, everywhere. Every surface that had a vertical edge had something pinned to it, and in a significant number of those somethings Luna was visible. Luna at 10, gap-toothed and bright-eyed. Luna at Hogwarts in her Ravenclaw robes with her wand tucked behind one ear. Luna at the Quibbler press, ink on her fingers, laughing at something off camera. Luna at the wedding, spinning in the garden, her hair loose. Xenophilius caught Harry looking. "She's been away," he said. Simply. As if Harry had asked. "I know," Harry said. "Naturalist expedition. Eastern Europe. She sends letters every 2 weeks." He picked up a teapot from the table and looked at it as though he'd forgotten he was holding it. "The last one arrived on Wednesday. She found a creature no one has catalogued. She was very pleased about it." "She would be," Harry said. There was a silence. Ron had positioned himself near the door in the particular casual way that meant he was blocking it without appearing to block it, a talent he'd developed over years of being the largest person in several difficult rooms. Hermione had her notebook open already, resting against her forearm, but she wasn't writing yet. She was watching Xenophilius with the careful attention of someone cataloguing rather than judging. Xenophilius set the teapot down. He turned to face Harry properly. "You want to know why?" he said. "I want to know several things," Harry said. "But yes. Start with why." Xenophilius moved to the nearest chair and sat down, not with the air of a man making himself comfortable but with the air of a man whose legs had decided the conversation was beginning whether the rest of him was ready or not. He pressed his hands together in his lap, fingers interlaced, and for a moment he looked at the floor. Then he looked up. "The Quibbler was the first publication to support you," he said. "When every other paper in Britain was printing what the ministry told them to print, we printed the truth. And the truth was, it was difficult. It cost us. We lost advertisers. We lost subscribers. I received letters that I would not like to describe in detail. My daughter," he stopped. Luna understood. She always understood, better than I did, why it mattered. "I know what the Quibbler did," Harry said. "I haven't forgotten." "No," Xenophilius said. "I didn't think you had. I'm not reminding you as a bargaining position. I'm giving you context." He paused. "When the Death Eaters came for Luna, when they took her, I made a calculation. I told myself it was a temporary thing. That I would get her back and then I would do what I should have done in the first place, which was to be braver." He said the word braver in the tone of a man who had said it to himself in the mirror many times and still found it inadequate. "Instead I told them where you were. And then you escaped anyway, and Luna came back, and I was left with," he opened his hands, briefly, and closed them again. "With what I had done. And what the Quibbler had become, Hermione said, quietly. Not accusatory. Observational. Xenophilius looked at her. Yes. When people found out, and they found out, of course they found out, the subscriptions went. Not all at once. Over months. A trickle, then a flood. By the end of last year we had 300 subscribers. 300, for a publication that had once had 12,000. He paused. There's a particular humiliation in watching something you built become worthless because you were a coward when it mattered. So you needed a story, Harry said. I needed, Xenophilius stopped. He looked at Harry with an expression that Harry couldn't quite categorize yet, something that was uncomfortable in its transparency. A man came to see me. 6 weeks ago. He said he had access to information about you, your medical history, documented over 7 years, that the public deserved to know. That they had a right to know what the war had cost the person at its center. That there was a public interest argument. His name, Harry said. Xenophilius hesitated. His name, Harry said again, and his voice didn't change, same volume, same tone, but something in the room shifted slightly, the way air shifted before weather. He gave his name as Aldous Crouch, Xenophilius said. Hermione wrote it down without looking up. What did he tell you about himself? Harry said. He said he was a ministry official. Department of Magical Health and Safety. He said he was acting in a private capacity, that this was not an official ministry disclosure, but that the information had come to his attention through his work and he felt it should be in the public domain. Xenophilius paused. He was very convincing. He spoke about you with what seemed like genuine concern. He said the wizarding world had put you through an enormous amount and had never properly acknowledged what that cost. That the file showed a level of suffering that the public had been shielded from and that shielding them from it was itself a kind of disservice. He made it sound like journalism, Hermione said. Yes, Xenophilius said. He made it sound like exactly the kind of journalism the Quibbler had once done. The kind that told the truth when the comfortable version was a lie. He looked at Harry. I know how that sounds. Tell me anyway, Harry said. It sounds like I was told exactly what I wanted to hear by someone who knew what I wanted to hear. He said it flatly, without inflection. The absence of inflection was, Harry thought, its own kind of honesty. He gave me the file. He said it had been obtained legally, through appropriate channels. I chose to believe that because believing otherwise would have required me to not publish it, and he stopped. I wanted to matter again, Mr. Potter. That is the complete and undecorated truth. I wanted the Quibbler to matter. I wanted to have done something right after so many things done wrong. The tower was quiet. Outside, through the window, Harry could see the hedgerows in the late afternoon light and beyond them the Devon countryside rolling gently toward a horizon that had no particular urgency. A bird crossed the window frame. A pigeon or something similar. Ordinary and indifferent. Did he tell you how he got it? Harry said. He said through legitimate access. His role at the ministry covered, he lied, Harry said. Xenophilius looked at him. He didn't access it through his ministry role. He had a records administrator at St. Mungo's use her login credentials, likely after tampering with her memory, and accessed my file remotely at midnight 3 days ago. It was stolen. And whoever he told you he was, the specific version of himself he presented to you, he was not a man acting out of concern for the truth. Harry paused. He was using you. The same way you used Luna's safety when you made your calculation. Someone made a calculation about you and decided you were the right instrument for what they wanted to do. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Xenophilius had gone quite still. His hands in his lap were no longer moving. His face had done something that Harry watched carefully, not collapse, exactly, but a rearrangement. A slow revision of the architecture. The look of a man who had built a justification and was watching someone remove its load-bearing wall. "He used me," Xenophilius said. "Not a question." "Yes," Harry said. "To do what?" "We think to destabilize Kingsley's administration. To create a scandal attached to me that would undermine the way Kingsley's government has anchored itself, the symbolic weight of the war's outcome. Crouch has been arguing inside the ministry for stronger centralized oversight and has been rebuffed twice. He wants a different kind of governance, and the fastest way to get it is to destabilize the current one." Xenophilius was very still. "And I gave him the front page," Harry said. "With your name on it." Another silence. Ron, by the door, had uncrossed his arms. He was watching Xenophilius with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite disgust but something in between them, the expression of someone watching a situation be more complicated than they'd wanted it to be. Xenophilius stood up abruptly. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to them for a long moment, his shoulders up around his ears, his hands at his sides. Then his shoulders dropped. A slow release, like pressure going out. "I can retract it," he said. "I'll print a retraction in the next issue." "When does the next issue go out?" Hermione asked. "Friday." "It's Wednesday afternoon," she said. "The story has been in circulation for 12 hours. It's been picked up by The Prophet, by Witch Weekly's Owl edition, by at least 3 Wizarding radio programs. A retraction on Friday will be seen by the Quibbler's 300 subscribers and no one else." Xenophilius turned around. He looked, Harry thought, smaller than he had at the start of the conversation. Not diminished exactly, more like a building after you removed the false facade. Smaller but more honest in its dimensions. "Then what do I do?" he said. "That," Harry said, "depends on what you're willing to do." He let the question sit for a moment. Xenophilius looked at him steadily, and Harry looked back, and in that exchange Harry was measuring something, not deciding whether to trust the man, but deciding how far Xenophilius had come in the 20 minutes since they'd walked through his open door. He'd been expecting defensive justification. He'd half expected Xenophilius to produce press freedom arguments, public interest rationales, the carefully assembled legal scaffolding that journalists built when they were preparing to be wrong loudly. Instead he'd got something rawer and less prepared, and Harry didn't think it was performance. Performance looked different. Performance had more elegance. "We need you to tell us everything Crouch told you," Harry said. "When he met you, where, exactly what he said about where the file came from, and anything else he told you about his intentions or his affiliations." "Everything. I'll tell you everything," Xenophilius said, without hesitation. "We'll also need you to make a formal statement to the DMLE," Hermione said. "Voluntarily. That matters. If you come forward voluntarily before they come to you, it changes your position considerably." "Am I going to be prosecuted?" Xenophilius said. "Directly." No tremor in the question. Whatever else he was not a man who flinched from direct questions once he'd decided to face a thing. Hermione glanced at Harry. Harry thought about the 12,000 copies. About the front page. About the access records and the clinical notes and patient declines again. About Healer Nakamura's precise, careful apology in the corridor. "That's not entirely my decision," Harry said. "The Medical Privacy Act gives me the right to press criminal charges. I haven't decided whether I'm going to use it." "That's honest," Xenophilius said. "I try to be," Harry said. "Here's what I can tell you right now. The person I want to hold accountable for this is Aldous Crouch. He designed it. He selected you. He stole the file. He's using a public institution, my private medical history, as a political instrument, which is a considerably more serious crime than publishing information someone told you was legitimate. If you help us get to him, that changes things." "Not all the way," Ron said, from near the door. Harry looked at him. Ron shrugged slightly, not backing down, just calibrating. He still published it, Ron said. I just think that needs to be said out loud in this room. It needs to be said, Harry agreed. Xenophilius. He turned back to the older man. You still published it. You made a choice without asking the right questions, and the reason you didn't ask them is because asking them would have got in the way of what you wanted to do. That's on you. Whatever Crouch did, whatever he told you, you still made that choice. And I need you to know, not for legal purposes, not for the record, but just in this room, that those pages had things in them that I had never chosen to share with anyone. Things that are mine. That have always been mine. Xenophilius was looking at him with the full weight of his attention now, no deflection, no reframing. The psychological evaluations, Harry said. The notes about what the Horcrux did to my nervous system. The Cruciatus documentation. Those are not public information because I decided they were not public information. Not because I'm ashamed of them and not because the wizarding world couldn't handle them. Because they're mine. They belong to me in the same way my hands belong to me, and someone printed them in a newspaper, and 12,000 people had them with their breakfast, and I didn't get to choose that. I know, Xenophilius said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way it hadn't been at the start of the conversation. I don't think you did, Harry said. Not cruelly. I think you knew it intellectually. I don't think you knew it in the way I needed you to know it. I think when Crouch told you it was in the public interest you let yourself believe that because it was easier than believing you were doing something to a person. The afternoon sun had shifted. It was coming through the window at a lower angle now, crossing the floor in a long trapezoid of gold, illuminating the dust motes and the stacked back issues and the tower's ordinary residue. Xenophilius stood in it, looking at Harry, and Harry looked back, and the moment had weight. You're right, Xenophilius said. Just that. Harry nodded. Right, he said. Then let's talk about Crouch. Hermione took the statement. She was extraordinary at it. Harry had known this about her in the abstract, had watched her organize and document and cross-reference for years, but watching her take a formal statement from a cooperative witness was something different. She was precise without being cold, thorough without being tedious, and she had a particular ability to ask the same question 3 different ways across 15 minutes of conversation in such a way that the person being asked never noticed but the answers, laid beside each other afterward, were more complete than any single version would have been. Xenophilius told them everything. Crouch had come to the tower on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks ago. He'd arrived by flu, which meant he'd known the flu address, not publicly available, which meant he'd done his homework or had access to records that included it. He'd presented himself as a concerned civil servant, privately motivated. He'd been well-dressed, mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the particular air of ministry officials who had been in the building long enough to have absorbed its rhythms. He'd spoken for 2 hours. He'd been, Xenophilius said, careful about certain things. He'd never explicitly stated how the file had been obtained. He'd spoken in terms of access and appropriate channels and information reaching his attention, language designed to imply legitimacy without providing specific confirmation of it. He knew you wouldn't press, Hermione said, writing rapidly. He knew I wouldn't ask the questions that would have ended the conversation, Xenophilius agreed. Did he make any indication of what he expected to happen afterward? After publication? Xenophilius paused. He was sitting forward now, hands on his knees, the posture of a man doing the work of remembering carefully. He said that the story would open a conversation that needed to be had. About how the wizarding world treats its heroes. About the gap between the public narrative and the private reality. He framed it as, he stopped. He framed it as a corrective. A necessary corrective to what he called the mythology of the victors. The mythology of the victors, Ron repeated, from the corner where he'd found a stool and settled on it. That's a phrase. He said Kingsley's administration had built itself on a story, Xenophilius said. The story of the hero and the victory and the new dawn. He said that story was precarious because it depended on no one looking too closely at its foundations. And that the best way to build something more durable was to clear the romanticized version away. By destroying me, Harry said. He didn't say that. What did he say? He said by humanizing you. Xenophilius's expression made clear exactly what he thought of that framing now. That the public image of you as essentially invulnerable and fundamentally heroic was doing a disservice to the necessary conversation about how the wizarding world structures power and responsibility. That showing the cost, the documented physical and psychological cost, would, he said, redistribute the symbolic load away from a single individual and toward the institutions of governance. Meaning Kingsley's administration falls, Hermione said, and a reshuffle creates a governance structure that Crouch has been arguing for. With him better positioned inside it, Harry said. Presumably, she said. Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the tower. Above him, somewhere in the upper floors, the press was quiet. He thought about the phrase redistribute the symbolic load, which was a very elegant way to say use Harry Potter's trauma as a political lever. He thought about Crouch's careful language, the deliberately imprecise terms about how the file had been obtained, the framing of destruction as humanization. The man was intelligent. That was clear. The kind of intelligence that understood exactly where to apply pressure and how to make the application look like concern. Did he contact you again after the first meeting? Harry asked. 3 times, Xenophilius said. Once by owl, twice by flu. The owl was a copy of the file. The flu contacts were to answer questions I'd had. He was very available. Very responsive. Because he was managing you, Hermione said. Yes, Xenophilius said. The word had the flat quality of something confirmed rather than admitted. Hermione closed her notebook and looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her. Between them, in that look, was the conversation they'd had at the Burrow kitchen table compressed into a single exchange. The working theory had become close to certainty, the circumstantial was accumulating, and the question was now not whether Crouch had done this but how to prove it in a way that couldn't be dismantled. Zeno, Harry said. Have you still got the copies of the file he sent you? Yes. And the owl correspondence? Yes. The specific flu contacts, do you have any record of them? Anything you wrote down after? Xenophilius looked at the desk in the corner. I keep a journal, he said. I wrote the substance of each flu conversation in it afterward. Old habit from my editing days, you document conversations because memories are unreliable and owl post is evidence. That's very helpful, Hermione said, and the warmth in her voice was genuine, which Harry noted was the right instinct at the right moment. Xenophilius got up and went to the desk. He dug through 3 drawers with the focused inefficiency of a man who knew where things were in the abstract but not in the specific, and produced from the back of the bottom drawer a leather-covered journal, a bundle of owl correspondence tied with blue string, and a flat envelope that contained, when Hermione opened it, a magical copy of Harry's medical file with Aldous Crouch's handwriting on the cover note. Hermione held up the cover note. She was very still. That's his handwriting on an envelope containing a stolen document, Ron said. It is, Hermione said. That's not circumstantial, Harry said. No, she agreed. It's not. She placed it very carefully on the table, the way you place things that had become important. The sun was almost down by the time they'd gone through everything. Xenophilius had made tea at some point, Harry hadn't quite tracked when. It had simply appeared, strong and slightly unusual in the way that things prepared in this house tended to be, and they'd drunk it while Hermione worked through the journal, cross-referencing dates and details and making notes in her own careful hand. At some point Harry got up and walked to the window. The Devon countryside was going purple at the edges in the dusk, the hedgerows darkening, a bat cutting a loose zigzag against the sky. He stood at the window and thought about the day. He thought about what he'd read on those pages. He thought about patient declines and about the cruciatus documentation and about the fact that somewhere in London, in a ministry office, a man named Aldous Crouch had gone home today believing that by noon everything had gone according to plan. He heard Xenophilius come to stand a few feet behind him. "I'll do whatever you need," Xenophilius said. His voice was quiet, aimed at the window. "Not asking forgiveness. Something different." "I know," Harry said. "Will you? Is there something I can print?" "In the Quibbler." "Something that would." "Not yet," Harry said. "When the time comes, yes. But not yet. Right now I need you to be quiet about this. All of it. Don't tell anyone what we discussed today. Don't reach out to Crouch. If he contacts you, let me know immediately." "Through Hermione?" "Through me." Harry turned from the window. "You have my address." Xenophilius blinked. "The Burrow?" "For now." "Yes." Harry held out his hand. Xenophilius looked at it for a moment that was longer than a handshake warranted. He took it and they shook once, firmly, and when they let go Harry thought that whatever this was, not forgiveness, not absolution, something more complicated and more useful, it was the beginning of a working arrangement, and working arrangements between complicated people had accomplished surprising things before. "One more thing," Harry said. "Yes?" "The retraction. Print it anyway. Friday. Even though it won't reach everyone. Print it anyway because it's the right thing to do and because it demonstrates good faith and because the Quibbler's reputation, whatever you're going to rebuild of it, needs to be built on something true." Xenophilius was quiet for a moment. "I'll write it tonight," he said. "Good," Harry said. He picked up his jacket. Hermione was already at the door, the journal and correspondence carefully in her bag, the cover note wrapped separately in a protective charm. Ron was at her shoulder. Harry crossed the room, stepped past the photographs of Luna on every surface, and went out through the open door into the darkening garden. Behind him, he heard Xenophilius Lovegood sit back down in his chair, alone in his tower, with the task of writing a retraction and the longer, harder task of understanding what he'd allowed himself to become. Harry walked out through the gate and into the lane. The stars were beginning, faint and early, in the deep blue above the hedgerows. He stood in the lane for a moment and breathed the evening air, Devon in August, earth and grass and something faintly like rain coming in from the west, and felt the shape of the day in his body. The weight of the morning, the precision of St. Mungo's, the long conversation in the tower. "Aldous Crouch," Hermione said, beside him. She said the name like a thing being placed on a list. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "He doesn't know we were here today," Ron said. "No," Harry said. "And I'd like to keep it that way until we're ready." "Ready for what specifically?" Ron said. Harry thought about the cover note. Crouch's handwriting on an envelope containing stolen goods. He thought about the access records and the obliviated administrator and the journal entries that placed a ministry official at the center of a criminal operation. "Ready to do this in the open," Harry said. "Ready to do it in a way that he can't manage or spin or contain. Because he's a man who controls narratives, and the only way to beat that is to take the narrative away from him entirely." He turned toward the lane's end. "Come on," he said. "I told Ginny I'd come back and tell her how it went." Ron made a small sound that might have been a comment on this. "Don't," Harry said. "I didn't say anything," Ron said. They operated, and the Devon lane was left to the darkening countryside and the bats and the first stars, and the tower stood in the evening as it always had, crooked and stubborn and full of the evidence of a man who was beginning, in the most painful possible way, to find his way back to something honest. Chapter 4. The man behind the owl. Thursday morning arrived at the Burrow with the particular quality of mornings before something happens, a charged stillness, the kind where even the gnomes seemed to sense that the air had different intentions today. Harry was up before anyone else, which was unusual enough that when Molly came downstairs at 6:30 she stopped in the kitchen doorway for a second, recalibrated, and wordlessly put the kettle on without asking questions. He was at the table with Hermione's notes spread in front of him. Not reading them exactly, He'd read them twice already, in the small hours when sleep had decided to be elsewhere, but sitting with them the way you sat with something before a decision hardened. The access records from St. Mungo's. Xenophilius's journal, open to the 3 pages of full conversation notes. The cover note in its protective charm, Crouch's handwriting clear and careful across the top. Molly set coffee at his elbow and went to the window and looked at the garden for a moment. He could see her reflection in the glass, the set of her shoulders, the quiet way she stood when she was thinking something she'd decided not to say. "You're not going to do anything reckless," she said. "Not a question." "No," he said. "But you are going to do something." "Yes." She turned around. She looked at him with the full weight of Molly Weasley's attention, which Harry had decided long ago was one of the more formidable experiences available in the wizarding world. She'd looked at him this way the first time he'd come to the Burrow at 11 years old, not with pity, not with performance, but with a kind of fierce maternal assessment that had taken him in and found him sufficient and decided something. "Good," she said, and went to start breakfast. Hermione arrived at 8 with a leather satchel and an expression that Harry had last seen in a Hogwarts library at 2 in the morning when she'd found the specific piece of information she'd been looking for. She sat down, opened the satchel, and pulled out 3 rolls of parchment, a copy of the Magical Governance Quarterly from 2 years ago with specific passages bookmarked, and a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a memory. "Whose memory?" Harry said. "The Records Administrator's," Hermione said. "Her name is Margaret Tibbs. She contacted the DMLE last night to make a formal report about the obliviation. During that process, a Ministry Obliviator was brought in to attempt a partial restoration. They can sometimes recover the surface layer of a removed memory, the most recent material, without recovering the full depth." She set the vial on the table with the precision of someone placing evidence. "They got 3 minutes. 3 minutes of what?" Ron said, coming down the stairs in a state that suggested he'd dressed at speed. 3 minutes of Margaret Tibbs standing in a corridor at St. Mungo's at approximately 11:30 p.m. on Monday night, Hermione said. "Speaking to someone whose face is not visible in the memory, either because the obliviation cut that specific detail or because the person knew to stay out of her direct eye line." "Crouch," Harry said. "Probably. The voice in the memory is male, mid-50s, educated, with what sounds like a Northern English accent that's been partially smoothed out. Consistent with the Crouch I've been reading about." She paused. "In the 3 recovered minutes, the voice asks Mrs. Tibbs to access a specific patient file and transmit a copy to an external address. Mrs. Tibbs is compliant, which suggests she was under some form of compulsion, either potion or mild imperious." "He used imperious," Ron said. "Partial imperious, possibly. Or something adjacent." The Obliviator who recovered the memory noted that Mrs. Tibbs's magical signature during the memory shows traces of external coercive charm. That's a separate criminal charge entirely." Harry looked at the vial. 3 minutes. Margaret Tibbs in a corridor, doing something she hadn't chosen to do, and then having the choice removed from her memory. A tidy operation. The kind of operation someone ran when they'd thought about it very carefully and had decided that tidiness mattered more than anything else. "He's not stupid," Harry said. "No," Hermione said. "He's the opposite of stupid. Which means going after him directly, walking into the DMLE with what we have, has specific risks. He has 12 years of ministry relationships. He knows the internal communication systems. If we file a report through standard channels, he will know about it within the hour." "You said that yesterday," Harry said. "I know. I've been thinking about what to do instead." She straightened the parchments on the table. "Kingsley. Going directly to the minister," Ron said. "Going directly to the minister, yes. But not with a report. With everything, the complete picture, assembled and documented, delivered in person in a way that doesn't travel through any standard ministry communication." She looked at Harry. "Kingsley is not Crouch's ally. But Kingsley is also a man who has to manage institutional consequences, and if we give him this incorrectly he will manage it in a way that minimizes disruption rather than maximizes accountability. So we need to give it to him in a way where managing it quietly isn't an option, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said. Which means we need one more thing before we go to Kingsley. She reached back into the satchel and produced a final piece of parchment. She set it on top of the others and smoothed it flat with both hands. It was a list of names. Harry read it. The names were members of the Wisengamot, the full judicial body, 23 members, their titles and affiliations printed in Hermione's neat hand. You want to brief the Wisengamot before the ministry, Harry said. I want to brief 3 specific members of the Wisengamot, Hermione said. She circled 3 names. These 3 are senior members with no political alignment to Crouch, with strong records on institutional accountability, and with the procedural authority to request an emergency judicial review of a ministry official's conduct. If we get the 3 of them briefed and on record before we go to Kingsley, then Kingsley's management options narrow considerably. Harry looked at the 3 names. When? He said. Today, she said. This morning. All 3 are in London, I checked. Ron was looking at his sister as though she just produced a rabbit from somewhere unexpected. When did you sleep? He said. I didn't need much, she said. That's not, Ron, she said, with the precise inflection that had ended that particular category of sentence reliably since they were 12. Harry picked up the vial of Margaret Tibbs's memory. He turned it over once, watching the silver-blue swirl of it move inside the glass. Somewhere in those 3 minutes was a voice that connected everything, the stolen file, the obliviated administrator, the cover note, Xenophilius's journal. The chain was almost complete. There's one gap, he said. Hermione nodded. We can place Crouch at St. Mungo's on Monday night through the memory. We have his handwriting on the cover note sent to Xenophilius. We have Xenophilius's statement placing a man matching his description at the tower 6 weeks ago. What we don't have is a direct connection between Crouch and the St. Mungo's liaison clearance being used to access the record system, because he didn't use his own clearance, he used Mrs. Tibbs's login. So we can prove he was there, Harry said. We can prove he sent Xeno the file. We can prove he had motive and means. But we can't prove, document to document, that he was the one who accessed the record system. Not yet, Hermione said. What does not yet mean? She looked at him steadily. It means I wrote a letter at 4 this morning to a contact I have at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Someone I trust. Someone who is not in Crouch's network. I asked her to pull Crouch's ministry access records for Monday night, specifically his full usage log and his building access card. She paused. She owed me back at 7. She reached into the satchel one final time and produced a single folded note. She handed it to Harry. He unfolded it. It was short, 4 lines, his contact's handwriting, no name signed, just an initial. Crouch's full log shows a call at 11:14 p.m. Monday to a private address in Devon. St. Mungo's outgoing flu records for the same evening show an unregistered connection from the hospital's administrative wing at 11:09 p.m. 5-minute window consistent with travel and setup. Sending full log by Secure Owl this afternoon. Devon, Harry said. Xenophilius's tower is in Devon, Ron said. Yes, Harry said. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window the garden was bright and ordinary, the gnomes doing their gnome business in the far beds, Molly's herbs in their pots on the sill leaning into the morning sun with the uncomplicated ambition of plants. Harry folded the note and put it in his pocket with the rest. Let's go, he said. The first Wisengamot member they needed was a witch named Eugenia Hartwell, who had sat on the Wisengamot for 22 years and who had, in the month after the war ended, been the first member to formally call for a review of Death Eater trial proceedings. She was 71, lived in Edinburgh, and maintained a small office in the Wiesengemot building on the north side of the Ministry of Magic complex. Harry had met her once, briefly, during one of Kingsley's post-war ceremonial events, and she had shaken his hand and told him that she hoped he'd come to find the practice of law interesting someday, which had struck him at the time as a peculiar thing to say and struck him now as unexpectedly prescient. She received them at 9 in the morning with the equanimity of someone who had learned through decades of judicial process not to show surprise at the arrival of unexpected visitors, and offered them tea and listened to Hermione present the case without interrupting once. At the end, she asked 3 questions. She was given 3 answers. She said she would make 2 fluke calls and have confirmations by 10, and she invited them to wait in her outer office, where there were chairs and a selection of reading material that ran heavily toward Wiesengemot procedure manuals and a single extremely old copy of a Muggle newspaper whose presence she didn't explain. The second member was a wizard named Albert Frobisher, who operated out of a chambers in Lincoln's Inn Fields in a space that existed between the Muggle legal buildings and the magical ones in the particular interpenetrating way that magical London liked to arrange itself. He was younger than Hartwell, early 50s, sharp-eyed, with the manner of a man who read documents for a living and had long since stopped being impressed by the contents of them. He read everything Hermione laid before him with the efficient speed of someone who assessed volume of documentation rather than page by page. He asked no questions. He sat back, looked at Harry directly, and said, "Who else knows about this?" 5 people plus the 3 of us, Harry said. All of them trustworthy. And Crouch himself? Doesn't know we've moved yet. Good, Frobisher said. Keep it that way until 3 o'clock. I'll be ready at 3. Ready for what? Ron said. Frobisher looked at him with the expression of a man who considered certain questions to be either self-answering or premature. For what comes next, he said. The third member was someone Harry knew. Griselda Marchbanks, who had examined him at his ordinary wizarding level examinations, who had witnessed Dumbledore perform magic she claimed she had never seen before or since, and who was, in the current Wiesengemot, the member with the longest uninterrupted service and the most procedural authority to act without referencing a full chamber vote in situations of documented urgency. She opened her door herself, looked at Harry for a long moment, and said, "I've been wondering when someone was going to do something about this. Come in." By noon they were back at the Burrow. Ginny was in the garden with a broomstick and an expression of focused irritation, not at them. Harry could see that immediately, at something she'd been working on aerially, some maneuver that wasn't going the way she wanted it to. She landed when she saw them coming through the gate and walked over with her hair wild from flying and a grass stain on her left knee. "How did it go?" she said. "Well," Harry said. "All 3?" she said. "All 3, he said." She nodded with the clean satisfaction of someone who had bet on the right horse. "Good. Lunch is on. Mum made something enormous. George is here." Harry stopped walking. "George is here?" "He came this morning. He and Ron had a long conversation and then George decided to stay for lunch, and then he decided to stay for dinner, and then he decided to stay in general for a while." She said it lightly but her eyes were careful. "He seemed like he needed to be somewhere with people." Harry nodded slowly. He hadn't seen much of George since the war. That was true of several people, not from avoidance, not exactly, more from the complicated arithmetic of grief, where sometimes the people who reminded you most of what you'd lost were also the people you most needed to be near and least knew how to be near. George and Harry had a specific geometry in this. Harry had been there when Fred died, which meant George knew it, which meant Harry knew he knew it, and they had been circling each other for 3 months with care and without resolution. He went inside. George was at the kitchen table eating toast with the focused energy of a man who had decided that toast was what he needed and was going to have an opinion about it. He looked up when Harry came in. Something moved through his expression, complex, quick, there and then managed. "All right, Harry," he said. "All right, George," Harry said. "Heard about the Quibbler thing," George said. "Yeah. Heard you've been sorting it out." Working on it. Good. George took another bite of toast. Anything I can do? It was such a straightforward offer, with such a complete absence of drama, that Harry felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't entirely noticed was tight. Maybe, he said. I'll let you know. George nodded and went back to his toast, and Harry went to the kitchen counter and made himself a sandwich, and the room moved around them with the ordinary noise of people who cared about each other having lunch, and for 20 minutes Harry just sat in it and let it be what it was. At 2 o'clock, Hermione spread everything on the kitchen table, the full assembled case, every document, the memory vial, Xenophilius's journal and correspondence, the FLU logs, the access records, the cover note, the 3 letters of intent from Hartwell, Frobisher, and Marchbanks confirming their positions and their procedural authority. She laid it out with the systematic care of someone who had been building toward this arrangement since 5 in the morning and who knew exactly what each piece meant in relation to every other piece. Ron looked at the table. That's a lot of evidence, he said. That's the point, Hermione said. When we walk into Kingsley's office with all of that, Harry said, I want it to be clear that we're not asking him to investigate. We're telling him what the investigation has already found, and we're telling him in front of Wizengamot authority that will require him to act. He might not appreciate that approach, Ron said. He doesn't have to appreciate it, Harry said. He has to act on it. Kingsley's a good man, Hermione said, and Harry heard the mild defense in it. I think it's worth saying that before we walk in there treating him like an obstacle. I know he's a good man, Harry said. That's why this works. A bad man would find ways to suppress this. Kingsley is going to do the right thing the moment we make it impossible for him not to. There's a less charitable way to say that, Ginny observed from the doorway, where she'd been leaning with her arms crossed, listening. Yes, Harry said. But this is the accurate way. She considered this. Fair enough. There's one more thing, Hermione said. They looked at her. Rita Skeeter, she said. The name dropped into the kitchen like something heavy. Ron made an immediate sound of objection. Ginny's eyebrows went up. George, who had apparently decided to remain present for this part, looked up from his second round of toast with the expression of a man who had just found an unexpected ingredient in something he'd been eating. No, Ron said. Hear me out, Hermione said. The woman put beetles in Harry's business for 2 years, she's the most widely read journalist in the wizarding world, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who found the fact inconvenient but was not going to pretend otherwise. The Prophet has a circulation of 140,000. If the story of Crouch's operation breaks through official channels, Kingsley controls the narrative, he'll announce an investigation, it'll go through proper procedure, it'll be accurate and legitimate and completely unreadable to 90% of the wizarding public. She paused. If Rita Skeeter breaks the story, every witch and wizard in Britain reads it over breakfast tomorrow morning. And she'll make it about Harry, Ron said. She'll make it about whoever I tell her it's about, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. I'm not afraid of Rita Skeeter, he said. She's useful and she knows she's useful and she knows I know she's useful. She also owes me a debt, in the moral if not legal sense, for the quick-quotes quill years. He paused. I'm not asking her to write the story I want. I'm giving her the actual story. The real one. Which is better than anything she could fabricate, and she knows it. You're going to meet with her, Ginny said. After Kingsley, Harry said. Yes. I want to be there, Ginny said. I was going to ask you to be, Harry said. She nodded, once, the way she nodded when something had been decided correctly. The Ministry of Magic at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon was a particular kind of busy, the post-lunch lull giving way to the late afternoon push, the atrium moving with witches and wizards in robes and carrying things, the fountain restored now to something approximating its former configuration, though the statue choices had been the subject of ongoing Wizengamot debate since May. The magical ceiling was doing something complicated with clouds that suggested the outside weather was building toward rain. Harry had been in this building in many configurations over the years, as a 12-year-old in stolen skin, as a 15-year-old facing a criminal tribunal, as an infiltrating 17-year-old with polyjuice-substituted features. He'd been arrested in this building, tried in this building, and on one memorable occasion in the previous November, awarded the Order of Merlin First Class in this building by a minister who'd shaken his hand for so long that Harry had begun to wonder if there was a specific protocol for withdrawing one's hand from a minister who was still shaking it. He walked through the atrium now as himself. Completely, unreservedly as himself. No disguise, no lowered head, no navigation by peripheral vision. He walked through the center of the atrium with Hermione on one side carrying the satchel and Ron on the other carrying a face that clearly communicated to anyone who glanced at it that this was not a social visit, and people moved, not dramatically, not in a parting of the sea way, but with the organic adjustment of a crowd that had encountered a specific kind of purpose and was instinctively making room for it. Griselda Marchbanks met them at the lift. She was wearing her full Wisengamot robes, which Harry had never seen outside of formal settings and which communicated, to anyone who understood what they meant, that she was here in her official capacity. "Frobisher and Hartwell are already upstairs," she said. "Kingsley knows we're coming," Harry said. "His secretary knows 3 members of the Wisengamot have requested an urgent meeting," Marchbanks said. "The specific nature of the meeting has not been communicated." "He'll have guessed," Hermione said. "He's a smart man," Marchbanks agreed. "He'll have guessed something. Whether he's guessed correctly remains to be seen." They took the lift to the top floor. The minister's corridor was the widest in the building, portraits of previous ministers along one wall giving their various painted occupants something to do on slow afternoons. Some of them were watching Harry with the particular interest of people who recognized a historical moment in progress and were planning to have opinions about it later. Kingsley's outer office had 2 assistants who both stood when the lift opened, and neither of them attempted to delay the party that was currently walking through their space, because Griselda Marchbanks in full Wisengamot robes was the kind of visual information that made the concept of "can I take a message" seem inadvisable. The inner office door opened from the inside before anyone knocked. Kingsley Shacklebolt stood in the doorway. He was a large man with a quiet authority that had always struck Harry as something that came from the inside rather than being performed toward the outside. He stood the way he stood because he was who he was, not because he'd decided standing that way would look appropriate. He was in minister's robes, deep blue, and he was looking at the assembled group in his doorway with the expression of a man whose guesses had, apparently, been at least partially correct. He looked at Harry for a moment longer than he looked at anyone else. "Harry," he said. "Kingsley," Harry said. "Come in," Kingsley said. The meeting took 45 minutes. Hermione presented. She was the right person to do it, structured, thorough, and possessed of the specific ability to present damning information in a tone that was informative rather than prosecutorial, which mattered when the audience was someone who needed to be brought to a conclusion rather than backed into one. She laid the documents out on Kingsley's conference table in the order that told the cleanest narrative: the access records, the memory vial, the flow logs, Xenophilius's journal, the cover note, the 3 Wisengamot letters. Kingsley read everything. He asked questions at specific points, quiet, precise questions, the kind that established facts rather than challenged them. He asked about the method of memory recovery and accepted Hermione's answer. He asked about the chain of custody for the cover note and Hermione walked him through it. He asked, once, looking up from the documents, whether Xenophilius Lovegood had made his cooperation conditional on anything. He asked for nothing, Harry said. He cooperated because he understood what had been done to him and chose to help correct it. Kingsley looked at him steadily. "And you believe him?" "Yes," Harry said. "All right," Kingsley said. When Hermione finished, Kingsley looked at Marchbanks. "The Wisengamot position," he said. "We are requesting the immediate suspension of Aldous Crouch from his ministry role pending a full investigation," Marchbanks said. "Hartwell and Frobisher are prepared to co-sign the suspension order, which under Wisengamot procedure requires no full chamber vote for an emergency provisional action. The full investigation will be brought before the chamber within 30 days. On what charges as they currently stand, Kingsley said. Coercive magical compulsion, Marchbanks said. Unauthorized access to protected medical records. Criminal distribution of private medical information. Potential imperious use, lesser charge, partial application, but on the table. Misconduct in public office. And, she paused with the timing of someone who had saved something specifically. Conspiracy to undermine the functioning of the Ministry of Magic. Which is a separate statute and carries a considerably higher penalty than any of the individual charges. Kingsley sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for one moment, not lost, not uncertain, but the look of a man checking his own understanding of a situation against the totality of what he'd just received. Then he looked at Harry. "I need to ask you something," Kingsley said. "Go ahead," Harry said. Crouch's underlying argument, not his methods, his argument, the idea that this administration is too dependent on symbolic association with you, too anchored to a single individual's public narrative. Is he wrong? The room was quiet. Harry looked at Kingsley for a long moment. He could feel Hermione being very still beside him. Ron was watching him with the expression he wore when he expected Harry to say something true. "He's not completely wrong," Harry said. "Which is what makes him dangerous." He identified a real problem and chose the worst possible solution. The answer to over-reliance on a symbol is not to destroy the symbol, it's to build institutions that don't need symbols. Which is a harder, slower thing, and Crouch didn't want to wait for it. He paused. "I'd rather be unnecessary, Kingsley. I'd rather the wizarding world's governance not need me in it. But that's a conversation for after we've dealt with the man who tried to do it by printing my medical history." Kingsley held his gaze. Something moved through his expression, something that Harry thought might have been, underneath everything else, relief. The specific relief of a man who had been carrying a structural concern alone and had just been told he didn't have to. "All right," Kingsley said. He stood. "I'll have Crouch suspended within the hour. The DMLE will be briefed by my office directly, I'll handle it personally to prevent internal leakage." He looked at Marchbanks. "Thank you, Griselda. Your promptness is, as always, exactly what the situation required." Marchbanks nodded with the compressed satisfaction of someone who considered promptness a professional virtue and an ethical one. "One more thing," Harry said. Kingsley looked at him. "The suspension will be noticed," Harry said. "By this afternoon, people in the ministry will know something is happening. By tomorrow morning, the prophet will have it. And whoever writes that story will frame it however they like, which means there will be 17 interpretations of what Crouch did and why and what it means, and half of them will find a way to make it about something other than what it actually is. Which is why," Hermione said, with the smooth handoff of two people who had discussed this and were not going to belabor it, "we'd like the story to break publicly tonight. In a controlled way. With the facts presented correctly. Through Rita Skeeter." Kingsley looked at her. Then at Harry. Then back at her. "Rita Skeeter," he said, in the flat tone of a man reviewing an unexpected item in a list. "She's the most read journalist in the wizarding world," Harry said. "And I'll be giving her the interview." "About Crouch?" "About everything," Harry said. "About the file. About what happened. About what it means. On my terms. Tonight." Kingsley was quiet for a moment. Then, "I won't stop you. It's your story." "Yes," Harry said. "It is." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Around the table, Hermione was already reorganizing the satchel with the efficiency of someone who had moved to the next item on the list. Ron was standing. Marchbanks was adjusting her robes. The afternoon light through Kingsley's office windows was doing something golden and long with the dust motes. "For what it's worth," Kingsley said, as they moved toward the door, "should have done this myself. Not this specifically, but I should have made sure you had more protection around your private information months ago. I should have thought about it. Harry turned back. You have a country to run, he said. You're part of that country, Kingsley said. I know, Harry said. I'm just not going to be the part you have to manage anymore. I'm going to be the part that helps. He went out through the door, and the corridor was long and quiet and lined with portraits, and he walked down it without looking at any of them, and at the end of it the lift was waiting. Rita Skeeter agreed to meet at 6. Of course she did. When Harry Potter's owl arrived at her office with a note that said I have the full story. Tonight. Your office or mine, your choice, the response had come back in 20 minutes with an address in Diagon Alley and the word mine underlined twice. Her office was above a stationery shop and smelled of parchment and something sweet and sharp that Harry suspected was the enchanted ink she used. She was behind her desk when they arrived, Harry and Ginny, specifically, because Harry had decided that specific pairing communicated the right things without requiring elaboration. Rita was in bright yellow robes that were either bold or aggressive depending on your relationship with her, and she had her quick quotes quill in her hand but she'd set it down when they came in, which was either professional courtesy or calculation. Mr. Potter, she said. Ms. Skeeter, Harry said. No quick quotes quill, Ginny said, sitting down. Rita looked at her. I wasn't planning, the quill goes away or we go away, Ginny said, pleasantly. Rita looked at Harry. She means it, Harry said. Rita opened her desk drawer and put the quill in it. She looked slightly like a person who had been outmaneuvered and was deciding whether to find it irritating or interesting. She settled on interesting. All right, Mr. Potter. I'm told you have a story. I have the story, Harry said. The real one. Not the one that's been circulating since this morning. He leaned forward. Someone stole my medical file and gave it to Xenophilius Lovegood. That person is a ministry official named Aldous Crouch, who was suspended from his position approximately 2 hours ago. I have documentation of everything, the access records, the flow logs, a partial memory recovery, correspondence, and a signed witness statement from Xenophilius himself. He paused. You can have all of it. You can print it tonight. And you can print my response to what happened to me, in my words, which I will give you right now. Rita was very still. Harry had never seen Rita Skeeter very still before. It was informative. You're giving me this exclusively, she said. Tonight, he said. Yes. Why me? Because you're the best at this, he said, and he said it completely without flattery, as a plain statement of fact. And because you've spent years printing things about me that weren't true, and I'd like, for once, for you to print something about me that is. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that Harry couldn't entirely categorize, journalistic hunger, obviously, but beneath it something else. A reckoning of some kind. All right, she said. She picked up a regular quill, dipped it, and held it over parchment. Tell me what happened. And Harry told her. All of it, clearly and directly, in the precise language of someone who had decided that the truth required no embellishment and no protection and no careful management. He told her about the file, what was in it, what it meant to him. He told her about Crouch, about the design of it, about Xenophilius being used. He told her about what it felt like to read his own clinical history over someone else's breakfast table. He told her the truth. And Rita Skeeter wrote it all down, and for once in her long and complicated career, she didn't change a word. Chapter 5, Luna Comes Home. The owl arrived at the burrow on Friday morning at 7:43, which Harry knew because he was watching the garden from the kitchen window when it came in, a small tawny bird with an unusual circular marking around its left eye that made it look permanently surprised, carrying a letter tied with what appeared to be a piece of vine rather than string. It bypassed the kitchen window entirely and went straight to the upstairs, which meant it was addressed to a specific person and had been given specific instructions, and 3 minutes later Harry heard Ginny's voice on the landing say something short and sharp in a tone that meant news. She came down the stairs 2 at a time. "Luna's coming home," she said. Harry set down his coffee. "When?" "Today. She's already en route, she sent this from somewhere in France." Ginny held up the letter, which was on unusual paper, slightly off-white, with handwriting that wandered pleasantly across the page in the way that Luna's handwriting always had, as if the letters were finding their own best arrangement. "She says she heard about the Quibbler. She says," Ginny paused, reading, her expression doing something complicated. "She says she's been following it through letters from people who thought she should know, and that she has significant feelings about several aspects of the situation that she intends to address in person." "That could mean anything," Harry said. "With Luna it usually means exactly what it sounds like," Ginny said. "She has significant feelings. She's going to address them." She folded the letter. "She asks if she can come here first. Before going home." "Of course she can," Harry said. He paused. "Does she know about everything? Not just the file, Crouch, the suspension, last night's profit?" "She mentions developments she considers significant," Ginny said. "So probably most of it. Luna has an extraordinary network for someone who mostly corresponds with people studying obscure wildlife." The Rita Skeeter piece had run in the Prophet at midnight. Harry had seen the proof copy at 10 the previous evening, sitting in Rita's office while she read it back to him with the focused satisfaction of a journalist who had written something that was purely, unambiguously factual and knew it was the most compelling thing she'd produced in years. The headline had been straightforward, which was by itself a novelty for Rita: "Ministry official suspended over Potter medical file theft." The full story below it, in slightly smaller type: "Harry Potter speaks. For the first time, in his own words." The piece had been, by any measure, thorough. Rita had presented the full chain: Crouch's operation, the Obliviated Records Administrator, the flow logs, the cover note, Xenophilius's cooperation. She'd quoted Harry's statement about privacy and personhood at length, without editorial gloss, and the restraint had made it more devastating than any flourish she could have added. She'd ended with a single paragraph that Harry hadn't expected: a brief, precise acknowledgement of her own publication history with Harry, the quick quotes quill years, the fabricated intimacies and invented anguish, and a statement that the present article had been produced without any enhancement whatsoever. He didn't know what had made her write that last paragraph. He hadn't asked. "Some things you accepted without requiring an explanation." By 7 this morning, according to the owl from Hermione that had arrived with his coffee, the Prophet's distribution network had confirmed a full sellout of the print run and 3 reprints in progress. Aldous Crouch had not made any public statement. His ministry office was reportedly sealed. 2 senior colleagues in his department had already approached the DMLE voluntarily with information about his conduct over the past 2 years, which suggested that Crouch's internal reputation had not been what his careful surface had presented. Kingsley had released a statement at 6 this morning, brief and formal, confirming the suspension and the investigation and thanking the Wiesengemot for its prompt procedural action. He had not mentioned Harry by name, which Harry appreciated. Xenophilius had printed his retraction. It had gone out with the Friday Quibbler at dawn, 300 copies, as Hermione had predicted, but the text of it had been photographed by a Prophet stringer and reproduced in full alongside Rita's piece, which had given it the wider circulation Xenophilius could not have managed alone. The retraction was, Harry had read it at midnight, genuinely extraordinary, not a legal disclaimer, not a careful minimization, but a full accounting of what Xenophilius had done and why and what it had cost the person it had been done to. It read like a man who had spent the previous night doing the hardest kind of thinking and had decided that the only way out was through the truth. Harry hadn't cried reading it. But he'd had to put it down once, briefly, and look at something else. Luna arrived at 11. She came through the Burrows garden gate with a large canvas bag over one shoulder and a wooden specimen case in her other hand and what appeared to be a small piece of Eastern European mountain flora braided into her hair, which had grown since Harry had last seen her and was now nearly to her waist, moving around her in the slight breeze with the unconcerned independence that Luna's hair had always had. She looked exactly like herself. Harry had been in the garden when the gate opened. Ginny had gone inside to find something and he'd stayed because the morning was good, warm and clear with a high blue sky, the kind of Friday that felt like it had decided to be decent about things. He watched Luna come through the gate and thought, not for the first time, that she was one of the few people in his life whose presence made the world feel simultaneously more strange and more manageable. "Harry," she said, when she saw him. She walked toward him without hurry, set her bags down a few feet away, and hugged him. It was a proper hug, not the brief socially appropriate version but the kind that lasted long enough to actually mean something. Luna hugged people as if she'd made a full commitment to it. He hugged her back. When she stepped back she held him at arm's length for a moment, her large pale eyes examining him with that particular quality of Luna's attention, which had always felt less like being looked at and more like being accurately perceived. "You're doing better," she said. "Than what?" he said. "Than last year. Than the year before. Than most of the years I've known you, actually." She tilted her head slightly. "You found something." Slowly, he said. "That's how you find the real things," she said. She picked up her bags. "Where's Ginny?" "Inside. She's been wanting to see you since the letter arrived." "I've been wanting to see her too. I found a creature in Slovakia that I think she'll find fascinating. It has the most extraordinary relationship with moving objects. I believe it may be responsible for several reported cases of quaffle interference in the 1840s. She walked toward the house. "I also need to talk to you about my father." "I know," Harry said. "Not yet," she said. "Later. This afternoon. I need tea first and I want to see Ginny and I want to meet whatever the family is cooking because I can smell it from here." She paused at the back door. "But later, Harry. We need to talk properly." "Whenever you're ready," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went inside, and through the kitchen window he could hear the particular quality of noise that filled a room when Luna Lovegood entered it, not loudness, but something that shifted the atmosphere, the way certain kinds of weather shifted the quality of light. Lunch at the Borough that Friday was the largest meal the table had hosted since the war. Molly had clearly decided that the combination of Luna's arrival and the events of the previous 2 days warranted a full production. There were roast potatoes, there was a dish Harry couldn't identify but that involved chicken and something that smelled like it had been to France at some point, there were 3 kinds of bread, and there was a pudding in the kitchen that Molly had described as just something I put together in the tone that meant she'd been planning it since yesterday. George had stayed. He sat across from Harry with slightly more light in his face than he'd had the previous morning, which Harry attributed partly to sleep and partly to the specific social energy that Luna generated. She had a way of making rooms feel larger, of giving people permission to take up more space than they'd thought they were allowed. Arthur was at the head of the table being quietly, thoroughly delighted by everything, by the food, by the company, by the particular sensation of his house being full of people he loved in circumstances that were better than they'd been the day before. He had the prophet in front of him and he kept picking it up and putting it back down with the air of a man who wanted to discuss it but was restraining himself out of respect for the fact that the story in it was not his. Ron was beside Hermione. They had the easy adjacency of people who had stopped performing the distance between them and had not yet started performing the closeness. They were in the honest middle of it, which Harry thought was probably the best place to be. Ginny was next to Harry. She was eating with one hand and had her other hand on the table, near his, not touching but close enough that he was aware of it, which was a geography he had come to find unexpectedly meaningful. Luna sat across from Harry and ate with great focus and described Eastern Europe at intervals in a way that somehow made everyone feel they'd been there. She had an extraordinary quality as a conversationalist of making the extraordinary sound entirely plausible and the implausible sound merely unreported. At some point during the second helping, George said, "I read the piece." Harry looked up. George was looking at him directly, which he hadn't been doing frequently. "Yeah?" Harry said. The bit about the Cruciatus documentation, George said. I didn't know about that. Any of it. He paused. I don't mean that as, I'm not having a feeling at you about it. I just wanted to say I read it. I know, Harry said. You should have had better protection, George said. Your medical records. Someone should have sorted that before yesterday. Lots of things should have been sorted, Harry said. I've been thinking about privacy charms, George said, and his voice had shifted into the register it went into when he was thinking practically, the Weasley's wizard wheezes part of his brain coming online. There's probably a market for personal records protection. Standard household spells are nowhere near what's needed for actual sensitive documentation. That's a good idea, Harry said. I know it is, George said, and there was the faintest edge of the old George in it, the brightness, the slightly combative confidence, and it was there for only a moment before it receded, but Harry caught it and held it internally like something worth keeping. I'd back it, Harry said. If you wanted to develop it. George looked at him. Financially? Financially. And however else. George was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah. All right. He picked up his fork. I'll think about it. Luna, across the table, was watching this exchange with an expression that managed to be entirely unobtrusive while also being utterly attentive. She caught Harry's eye and gave him a very small smile, not commentary, just acknowledgement. He nodded back. After lunch, after the clearing up and the tea and the point at which people dispersed into the afternoon with the various velocities of a family reconfiguring itself after a big meal, Arthur and Molly to the garden, Ron and Hermione to the sitting room with the case files still spread between them, George upstairs with what Harry suspected was a notebook. Luna found Harry in the small side room off the kitchen that the Weasleys used as a sort of overflow space, half study and half storage. With a window seat that overlooked the side garden and a shelf of gardening books and old Quidditch magazines. He'd gone there deliberately. Not to hide, to wait. Because Luna had said this afternoon and he trusted that she would find him. She came in without knocking, which was Luna entirely. She sat down on the other end of the window seat, tucked her feet under her, and looked out at the garden for a moment. I got the first letter about it on Wednesday, she said. From Ginny. Then one from Neville, who'd heard from Hannah Abbott, who'd read it in the Quibbler before the implications had been fully discussed publicly. And then on Thursday I got 3 letters at once, one from Hermione, which was the most detailed, obviously, and one from my father. Harry turned to look at her. He wrote to me the night you went to see him, she said. He wrote it that same night, apparently. He said you came, and that you listened, and that he said you were very clear about what had happened. He said you shook his hand when you left. He was honest, Harry said. He could have been defensive about it. He wasn't. He was the same way when I came home the first time, Luna said. After the cellar. He told me exactly what he'd done. He didn't try to explain it away. I think, she paused, and looked at her hands. I think he learned something about honesty from losing me for 6 months. Or from getting me back. I'm not entirely sure those are different things. Are you angry at him? Harry said. She thought about this in the way Luna thought about things that deserved actual consideration rather than immediate response. Yes, she said. In a specific way. Not the kind of angry that wants to punish someone. The kind that wants them to understand what they've damaged. She paused. I'm angry on your behalf, I think, more than for myself. What he did to you, what he allowed to happen to you, is its own thing, separate from our story. You don't have to be angry on my behalf, Harry said. I know, she said. I'm doing it because I want to, not because you need me to. She looked at him sideways. You know that's allowed. I'm getting better at knowing that, he said. She smiled slightly. I know. I noticed. You got better at it while I was away. She looked back out the window. You went to see him and you didn't let him off the hook and you didn't destroy him either. You gave him something to do instead. That's actually quite extraordinary. Hermione's plan, mostly, Harry said. Hermione's legal framework, Luna said. Your instinct about who Xenophilius is and what he needed. Those are different things. She paused. He's going to try to rebuild the Quibbler properly this time. Did he tell you that? Not in those words. He told me, she said. In the letter. He said he wants to try to do it the way he should have been doing it. And he wants to know if I'll come home and help. She was quiet for a moment. A bee moved past the window, unhurried and golden in the afternoon light. I haven't decided yet. Whether I'm ready to come home. Whether home is the right word for the tower right now, with everything in it. That's fair, Harry said. It's complicated, she said. Which is different from impossible. She turned to look at him fully, and the quality of her attention settled on him the way it had in the garden, precise and unperforming. How are you, Harry? And I mean that in the real way, not the social way. He thought about the question. Not defensively, just honestly. The way that Luna had always somehow managed to make honest answers feel like the obvious choice. I'm better than I was last week, he said. Last week I was still trying to figure out if wanting quiet was the same as being broken. I don't think it is. I think I just needed something to do. He paused. I read those pages on Wednesday morning and something in me that had been waiting for direction found it. Which is a strange thing to say about having your medical file stolen. Not strange, Luna said. Aligning. Sometimes things that should never happen are exactly the things that organize you. The cruciatus documentation, he said. She waited. Reading it in a newspaper was, not what I would have chosen. Obviously. But reading it at all, in those specific clinical terms, was the first time I'd seen it written down and understood what it was. What it actually was. Not a thing that happened and then I kept going. A documented, specific injury. He stopped. Healer Nakamura offered psychological support again. What did you say? I said thank you, he said. And I've been thinking about whether I meant it as a real answer rather than a polite one. Luna nodded. That's progress, she said. From patient declines to actually thinking about it is a significant distance. He looked at her. You read the file. Hermione sent me excerpts in her letter, Luna said, without apology. I asked her to. I wanted to understand what had been done. She paused. I hope that's all right. He thought about it. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was. Not because the information was now public, that was already beyond recalling, but because Luna asking to understand was different from 12,000 people reading it with their breakfast. Luna asked because she wanted to know him better, and that was a different thing entirely. It's all right, he said. Good, she said. A pause settled between them, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that had furniture in it, if you wanted to sit down. He's going to be all right, Harry said. Your dad. Not immediately and not easily, but I think he's going to find his way to it. Luna looked at the garden for a long moment. The afternoon was aging now, the light going amber at the edges. I think so too, she said. He's been carrying the cellar for a long time. Maybe this is part of how he puts it down. She uncurled from the window seat and stood, stretching with the uncomplicated physicality of someone who'd been traveling for days. I'm going to go home tomorrow. To the tower. I told him I'd come. Good, Harry said. I'm not forgiving him immediately, she said. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is a process and I'm at the beginning of it, and I think it's important to be honest about where you are in a process rather than pretending to be further along than you are. That's very sensible, Harry said. I have my moments, she said, entirely seriously. She picked up her bag from where she'd left it by the door. Harry. Yeah? Come and visit. Not immediately. But when things have settled. Come to the tower. She paused. My father needs to see who you are when you're not managing a crisis. I think it would be good for him. He considered this. All right, he said. She smiled, a full one this time, wide and genuine and belonging entirely to her. She went out through the door, and he heard her in the kitchen getting more tea, and through the window the garden went on being a garden in the way that gardens did, unaware and indifferent and continuously alive. Evening came in without hurry. The burrow settled around its occupants the way it always settled, crookedly, warmly, with small adjustments rather than dramatic ones, everyone finding their way back to their preferred corners as the day wound down. Harry sat in the garden after dinner. The sky was doing something extraordinary, the specific late August combination of clear air and the angle of the lowering sun that made the horizon go colors that seemed unlikely until you were looking at them. He'd brought a mug of tea out, and he sat in the garden chair that had been there since before he'd known this family and might have been there since before any of them were born, and he looked at the sky. Ginny came out at some point and sat on the grass nearby. She had a copy of Quidditch World in her lap but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the sky too. The Peace and the Prophet today, she said. What about it? The bit you said about privacy. About what those pages belonging to you actually means. She paused. I've been thinking about that all day. Yeah? You said they're yours the same way your hands are yours. That you didn't withhold them from the public because you were ashamed of them. You withheld them because they were yours to withhold. She paused. I don't think you'd ever said anything like that before. About yourself. No, he said. It's different from how you used to talk about the war stuff. About what happened to you. She was choosing her words carefully, not with hesitation but with the precision of someone who knew the difference between careful and hedged and was aiming for careful. You used to talk about it like it was the cost of something. Like the things that happened to you were a bill that had been paid and now you didn't need to look at the receipt. Harry thought about this. The garden around them was going blue and gold, the gnomes invisible, the apple tree still. I think I used to believe, he said slowly, that if I was upset about what happened to me, it was somehow ungrateful. That I'd survived and other people hadn't, and so the appropriate response was to be functional rather than feeling. He paused. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? I think what happened to me specifically. Not to the symbol or the hero or the public property. To me. And I'm allowed to have a full response to it. He turned to look at her. It took me a while to figure out that's not selfishness. She looked back at him. She'd been building towards something, he could tell. She had the quality about her that came when she was holding something and waiting for the right moment, and he thought the right moment had just announced itself. I want to tell you something, she said. And I want you to hear it as what it actually is, not as something to manage or respond to strategically. Okay, he said. When I read the file, she stopped briefly. When I read what was in those pages, the Cruciatus documentation, the Horcrux notes, all of it, I wasn't thinking about the war or the history or what it meant publicly. I was thinking about you. The specific you, sitting across from me at breakfast, walking around this garden, flying. She held his gaze steadily. And I was angry. Genuinely, specifically angry, in a way I haven't been since May, that those things had happened to you and you had been carrying all of it alone and the first time most people found out was because someone stole it. Ginny, I'm not finished, she said, gently. I'm angry that you've been declining psychological support for 3 years because you didn't think you were worth the time. I'm angry that you've been trying to figure out if wanting quiet is the same as being broken. I'm angry that you spent 17 years with something living inside you that wasn't you, and you didn't know, and now you know and the knowing is also something you're managing alone. She paused. And I know you don't need me to be angry on your behalf. Luna said the same thing to you earlier and you know it's allowed. I'm saying it because it's true and because I love you, and I think you should know that the people who love you aren't just grateful you survived. We're invested in you specifically. The actual you. Not the symbol. The sky was deep orange now, deepening at the edges toward purple. The tea was cold in his mug. The burrow's lights were coming on inside, warm yellow through the kitchen windows. Harry looked at Ginny for a long moment. I know, he said. And then, because she'd been precise and honest and he owed her the same, I've been thinking about what Healer Nakamura offered. The psychological support. I've been thinking about it more seriously than I've been letting myself admit. She nodded. Not relieved, not triumphant. Just present. I think I want to try it, he said. Not because the file made me. Because I've been looking at those pages all week and I think there's a version of me that they point toward, a version that's had all those things happen to him and has actually dealt with them instead of carrying them. And I want to be that version. He paused. I think I'm ready to actually want that. Harry, that's really good, she said, and her voice had gone soft, the way it sometimes did when she put down the composure and let what she felt be what it was. Don't make it a big thing, he said, but he was smiling. I'm not making it a big thing, she said. She reached over and took his hand properly, fingers threaded through fingers, her thumb pressed against the back of his hand. I'm glad. They sat in the garden together while the sky finished what it was doing with the light, and inside the burrow the family moved around each other in the easy domestic rhythm of people who were whole and broken and repairing all at the same time, which was perhaps the most human way to be, and somewhere in a tower in Devon a man was writing in the way he'd once known how to write, and somewhere in London a suspended ministry official was discovering what happened when the careful edifice of a life built on control began to come apart, and the summer evening held all of it without preference or comment, the way evenings did. Harry held Ginny's hand and looked at the last of the light. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow what? She said. I'm going to write to Healer Nakamura, he said. She squeezed his hand once. Okay, she said. Just that. Just okay. Which was exactly the right thing, and she knew it, and the garden went on around them in the warm and the dark and the turning of the season. Later, much later, when the house had gone quiet and he was back upstairs in the small room they'd given him, with the window open and the August night coming in, Harry took out Xenophilius's retraction, which he'd kept folded in his jacket pocket all day, and read it again. It was different the third time. The first time he'd had to put it down. The second time he'd gotten through it with a kind of numb acknowledgement. The third time he read it as what it was, a man trying to find the specific words for a specific wrong, and not making a great job of it, and not giving up. Near the end, Xenophilius had written, "There is a difference between a story that is true and a story that is yours to tell. I confused those two things. They are not the same thing. The first belongs to everyone. The second belongs only to the person who lived it." Harry folded the retraction and put it on the bedside table. Outside the window, the last of the summer stars were scattered across the dark in their careless, ancient abundance, doing nothing and meaning everything, the way stars always had. He lay back on the pillow and listened to the burrow around him, its small sounds, its structural size, the particular creak of the third stair that had never been fixed, and thought about tomorrow. Not the investigation, not the Weisengamot hearing, not Aldous Crouch and what was coming for him. Just tomorrow as a day. Just the garden in the morning and coffee and the people who would be at the table. Just the letter he was going to write. Just the ordinary, specific, entirely his own life that was already beginning to take the shape he wanted it to take. He fell asleep faster than he had in months. Chapter 6, On the record. The letter to Healer Nakamura took 3 drafts. The first was too formal, it read like a ministry correspondence, all correct grammar and careful distance, the kind of letter Harry had learned to write when dealing with institutions that required a specific register. He scrapped it. The second was too apologetic, full of qualifications, and if you still have time and only when convenient, the paper version of making yourself small in a doorway. He scrapped that one too. The third was short and direct and said what it meant, which was that he was ready to talk, that he'd like to schedule a first appointment at her earliest availability, and that he appreciated the fact that she'd kept asking. He sent it with the Burroughs barn owl at 7 Saturday morning, standing in the garden in yesterday's jeans with a mug of coffee going cold in his other hand and the August air doing something fresh and good after the night's rain. Ginny found him there when she came down 20 minutes later. She didn't ask about the owl. She poured her own coffee and stood beside him, and they looked at the garden together, which was wet and very green and had a quality of having been cleaned, the way gardens looked after rain, everything slightly more itself than it had been the day before. Luna left at 6, Ginny said. I know. I heard her. She moves very quietly for someone carrying that much equipment. She always has, Harry said. Ginny sipped her coffee. I got an owl from the Harpies. Preseason official starts Monday. We're training at the Appleby ground this year while Holyhead does pitch repairs. She said it in the tone of someone who was giving information rather than asking a question. Monday, Harry said. Yeah. Good, he said. And he meant it, not with relief, the way he sometimes meant things that involved Ginny doing something that took her elsewhere. With the specific warmth of watching someone go toward what they were meant for. You've been brilliant this week. I want you to know that. She turned to look at him. I didn't do anything dramatic. No, he said. That's what I mean. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to know. Then she looked back at the garden. Come to the Holyhead game in 3 weeks, she said. I'll put you on the list. I'll be there, he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went inside to make breakfast, and Harry stayed in the garden for another few minutes with his cold coffee and the rain-clean air and the particular feeling of a week arriving at its necessary end. The Wisengamot emergency hearing for the Aldous Crouch matter was set for the following Thursday, but the ministry moved faster than that. By Saturday afternoon, Kingsley's office had confirmed to the Prophet that the DMLE investigation was formally open, that 3 additional witnesses had come forward voluntarily, and that Crouch's ministry clearances had been fully revoked pending proceedings. The St. Mungo's liaison role had been suspended, and the hospital had released a statement that the position would be restructured before any new appointment. Harry knew about all of this through Hermione, who had become the operational hub of the situation in the way she became the operational hub of most situations that required sustained organization, not because anyone had designated her that, but because she was constitutionally incapable of being adjacent to an incomplete process. She arrived at the Burrow at noon with Ron and a folder of updates and the air of someone who had slept well and intended to continue doing so now that the active phase was winding toward resolution. They sat in the garden, Harry, Hermione, and Ron, with sandwiches Molly had produced without being asked and the folder open on the table between them, and they went through it. Crouch had retained a solicitor. The solicitor had made no statement. The 3 additional witnesses were all former or current ministry colleagues who had either witnessed or been told about conduct that, in context, now took on specific significance. Marchbanks had confirmed the Wisengamot would sit Thursday. He's going to argue he was acting in the public interest, Hermione said. His solicitor will frame it as an act of civic accountability, an attempt to correct an imbalance in public information access. They'll lean on the public figure doctrine, the argument that people in Harry's position have reduced privacy expectations. Do they? Ron said. In very narrow circumstances, Hermione said. Actions in a public capacity. Decisions that affect others. Not, she paused. Not medical histories. Not what a healer writes in private clinical notes about a patient's nervous system. That has never, under any reading of wizarding privacy law, been considered fair game. She closed the folder. His defense will be creative. It won't be successful. What does he get? Harry said. If convicted on all charges, Azkaban, minimum 18 months. The imperious adjacent charge carries the heaviest penalty. She paused. Realistically, with his solicitor and his 12 years of ministry relationships, he'll probably negotiate the lesser charges down and end up with a fine and a community-based sentence rather than Azkaban. Ron made a sound of displeasure. I know, Hermione said. Harry was quiet for a moment. He'd been thinking about this specific question since Thursday, not what Crouch deserved in the abstract, but what outcome actually served the purpose. The conviction matters more than the sentence, he said. On the record, officially, that what he did was criminal. That's the thing that can't be managed away. The precedent, Hermione said. Right. If he gets convicted, that conviction becomes part of how this situation is legally understood going forward. Anyone who tries to use stolen medical records as a political instrument in the future is doing it against a documented precedent of criminal prosecution. He picked up his sandwich. That's what I wanted from this. Not Azkaban for Crouch specifically. The precedent. Ron looked at him. You've been thinking like Hermione, he said. Don't say that like it's surprising, Hermione said. It's a bit surprising, Ron said. It's not, Harry said. I've just been paying attention. Ron grinned, the first proper grin Harry had seen from him all week, the full one that made him look 15 again. All right. Fine. You've always been paying attention, I just usually get credit for the emotional intelligence. You do have excellent emotional intelligence, Hermione said. I do, Ron agreed, satisfied. He picked up his own sandwich. What about the prophet? The follow-up pieces? 3 more today, Hermione said. 2 are straightforward news reporting of the suspension. 1 is an editorial about the systemic gaps in patient records protection that Crouch was able to exploit. It's actually quite good. It quotes several healers anonymously and calls for a formal review of the Magical Medical Privacy Act. Is that what you'd want? Harry said. It's what I'd want, she said. The act is 60 years old. The digital, magical equivalent, access systems at St. Mungo's are considerably more sophisticated now than they were when the act was written. The law hasn't kept pace. She paused. I've been thinking about doing something about that, actually. Doing something how? Ron said. I've been thinking about the law, she said, with the careful tone of someone not quite ready to elaborate. Formally. As a profession rather than as an emergency improvisation. Ron looked at her properly. Harry looked at her too. I mean, I've been thinking about training, she said. As a wizarding solicitor. Specifically in institutional law. Because cases like this, she gestured at the folder, this happens because there are gaps, and gaps exist because no one is paying enough sustained attention to where they are, and I think I could be, Hermione, Ron said. She stopped. That's brilliant, he said. She blinked. I wasn't finished explaining, you don't need to finish, he said. It's obviously right. It's you, it's completely you. He paused. Why haven't you said this before? I only really understood it this week, she said, and she sounded slightly surprised at herself. I think I understood it when I was sitting in Brightwell's office and I realized that every single thing Crouch was able to do existed in a legal gap that someone should have closed years ago. And that someone could be me. She looked at the garden, then back at them. I know it's a significant change from what I'd been thinking. What had you been thinking? Harry said. Various things, she said. The ministry, in some capacity. Teaching, possibly. Various options that all had the quality of being sensible rather than specific. She straightened the folder that didn't need straightening. This is specific. Then that's what it is, Harry said. She looked at him with the expression she'd had at 15 when he'd said something unexpectedly right and she hadn't wanted to make a production of it. Yes, she said. I suppose it is. They ate their sandwiches in the garden, and the afternoon went on around them with its September-adjacent warmth, and the three of them sat together in the easy silence of people who had known each other for nearly 10 years and had stopped needing to fill space with anything other than what was actually there. The interview with Rita Skeeter ran in the Sunday Prophet. Harry read it at the kitchen table at 8 in the morning, alone except for Molly, who was doing something involving the bread bin and several jars with the private focus of someone whose hands needed to be busy. He'd already read it once the night before. Rita had sent him a proof copy, which was not standard practice for her but which she'd done without comment, and he'd read it and sent it back with 2 minor corrections that she'd incorporated without argument, which was possibly the most surprising thing that had happened all week. Reading it in print was different. It wasn't different the way the Quibbler file had been different, that had been the shock of unwanted exposure, of finding private things public without consent. This was different in the way that something chosen felt different from something imposed. He'd chosen every word of his quoted statement. He'd read the proof. He'd sent it back. The version in the Sunday Prophet was the version he'd agreed to, and reading it in newsprint, in the actual paper, with his name above the column and the headline that Rita had finally settled on, in his own words, felt like something that had been taken from him and been returned. Not exactly. Not the specific thing that had been taken. But something adjacent to it. Something in the same family. The piece was long. Rita had given it half the front page and then a full page inside, which was the most prominent placement the Sunday Prophet offered. She'd written the surrounding material with restraint that Harry suspected cost her considerably. The frame was clean. A ministry official had orchestrated the theft and publication of a private citizen's medical records as a political instrument, and the private citizen in question had investigated, documented, and helped prosecute the case, and had one thing to say about it. Then Harry's statement, in full, 6 paragraphs. He read it again. The paragraph about privacy, the hands analogy, which had come out of him in Rita's office without planning. The paragraph about the clinical language, the way it had felt to read his own history in that register in public. The paragraph about declining psychological support for 3 years, which he'd included because Hermione had said, when he mentioned it on Thursday night, that including it would do more for the wizarding world's understanding of why that particular kind of help mattered than anything she could legislate. He'd thought about that and agreed. The final paragraph was the shortest. I'm not a symbol. I've never been one, though I understand why people needed me to be. I'm a person who survived things that should not have happened, and those things are mine. They always have been. What happened this week was an attempt to use them as a tool without my knowledge or consent. I'm grateful to the people who helped me address it. I'm grateful to Xenophilius Lovegood, who made a serious mistake and then chose to help correct it. And I'm grateful that the truth, in this case, turned out to be the most effective thing I had. Molly was very still by the bread bin. Harry looked up. She was facing the wall, her hands on the counter. He could see from here that she was not doing anything with the jars. She was just standing. Molly, he said. I'm fine, she said. You don't have to be fine, he said. She turned around. Her eyes were bright. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she was, mother, protector, the woman who had set a place at her table for him before she'd ever had reason to, and she said, I am so incredibly proud of you. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. He meant it completely. She nodded, once, the Molly Weasley nod that ended sentences requiring no further addition, and turned back to her bread bin, and Harry folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of his jacket, and went outside. The owl from Healer Nakamura arrived at noon. It was brief and warm and confirmed an appointment for the following Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, at her office in St. Mungo's 3rd floor. She said she was glad he'd written. She said, and Harry read this part twice, that the work he'd done this week, in public and evidently in private, was not nothing, and that it would have been easy to confuse the external resolution with the internal one, and that she was glad he hadn't confused them. He wrote back confirming Wednesday and folded the reply before he could overthink it and sent it with the same barn owl, who seemed to find the back-and-forth journey acceptably purposeful. Then he went back inside and found Ron in the hallway putting on a jacket. "Where are you going?" Harry said. "Hermione's. She wants to start looking at solicitor training options." Ron paused. "I'm going to look at Auror applications while she does that." Harry stopped. "You're applying again?" Ron had withdrawn his Auror application in June, citing reasons he hadn't fully articulated, which Harry had understood to mean that the idea of spending more time in institutional structures immediately after the war had felt like continuing something he hadn't agreed to continue. "Yeah," Ron said. "I think I was waiting to feel like myself again. I think I do." He looked at Harry levelly. "Don't make it a thing." "Not making it a thing," Harry said. "It's a thing," Ron said. "I just don't want you to make it one." "It is a thing," Harry said. "A good thing?" Ron nodded. "Yeah." He put his hand on Harry's shoulder briefly, the particular Ron Weasley physical punctuation that meant something complete. Then he went out through the front door, and Harry heard him apparate from the garden path with the clean crack of someone who had somewhere specific to be. George appeared at 3 with a roll of parchment covered in what turned out to be the preliminary design framework for what he'd decided to call Weasley's Wizard Safeguards, a line of personal records protection products that included a document security charm, an owl interception warning system, and something he described as a privacy perimeter for home use. He spread the parchment on the kitchen table with the energy of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 24 hours and had produced, in that time, more coherent output than most people managed in a week. Harry read through it. "This is actually very good," he said. "I know it is," George said. "I need capital." "How much?" George named a figure. Harry thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "Fine," he said. George blinked. "That was fast." "It's a good product and you're the right person to build it," Harry said. "I don't need to think longer than 4 seconds about that." George looked at him with an expression Harry hadn't seen from him before, something that was gratitude but more specific than gratitude. Something that was about being taken seriously rather than being given something. "Right," George said. He rolled the parchment back up. "I'll have formal proposals by next week." "Whenever," Harry said. George started to leave, then stopped. He turned back, and he had the look of someone who had been carrying a sentence for a while and had decided to put it down. "Fred would have loved this week," he said. "The whole thing. The investigation, the ministry, Rita Skeeter of all people, he would have been insufferable about it. In a good way." He paused. "I just wanted to say that. Because you were there when he, and I've never properly said." Harry looked at George and didn't say anything about it being all right or not being necessary, because George knew it wasn't all right, had never been all right, and Harry saying so wouldn't change the weight of what George carried. "I think about him," Harry said. "A lot. Not just then. Him specifically." George nodded, once, the jaw-set nod that was the Weasley family's shared language for things that couldn't be made smaller than they were. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." He went out, and Harry stood in the kitchen for a moment with the afternoon light on the floor and the sound of the burrow around him. He went flying at dusk. Not on anyone else's broom, he'd bought one in July, quietly, from a shop in Diagon Alley where they'd recognized him and had the decency not to make a ceremony of it. A Nimbus 2001, not the fastest current model but a proper broom, solid and responsive, the kind that had opinions about direction and expected its rider to have matching opinions back. He'd kept it at the burrow because he was still at the burrow, and he went to the garden shed and got it and walked to the far end of the garden where the apple tree and the gnome-populated border gave way to the open field that backed the property. He kicked off. The feeling of leaving the ground was something Harry had decided, somewhere in the last 3 months, that he was not going to try to explain or articulate. It was one of the things that was simply itself, the specific physical fact of rising, the air-changing quality around him, the ground receding to an abstraction. He'd been flying since he was 11 years old, and it still felt like it had the first time, like the most natural thing, and also like a gift. He went up until the burrow was the specific model toy version of itself that it became at altitude, the leaning chimneys, the improbable upper stories, the garden a messy green rectangle. The Devon countryside stretched around it in every direction, the evening light picking out hedgerows and lanes and the distant silver thread of a river. Above him the sky was the color of something between day and night, the blue deepening toward the east while the west held the last of the gold. He flew. Not training, not warming up, not toward anything specific, just flying, the way he'd flown as a child on the Hogwarts pitch before anyone had explained to him what Quidditch was or what catching the snitch meant or what role he was supposed to play in the game. Just motion, just air, just himself on a broom above a world that had the quality, from up here, of being entirely manageable. He thought about the week. He let himself think about it fully, in the way he'd been learning to do, not to process it for useful output, not to extract lessons or actions or the next step, but just to let it exist in its own volume. The morning with the owls. The Burrow kitchen, the Quibbler front page. His own name at the top of the file. St. Mungo's and Healer Nakamura in the corridor. Xenophilius in his tower, alone with his photographs. Crouch's handwriting on the cover note. The Wisengamot members, Kingsley's office, Rita Skeeter writing without her quill. Luna coming through the garden gate with mountain flowers in her hair. Ginny in the garden, her hand in his, the sky going orange. The letter he'd written at 7 this morning. The owl going out. He thought about patient declines and about the version of himself who had declined, and about the version of himself who was making a Wednesday afternoon appointment, and about the distance between those two versions which was, he thought, measurable. Short enough to see across. Long enough to matter. He banked left, a long gentle arc, and came around above the burrow's roof, and looked at the lit windows below him, the kitchen gold and warm, the sitting room with its familiar cluttered light, the upstairs rooms going on in their comfortable stacked disorder. He could see, through the kitchen window from here, Molly at the stove. Could see the shadow of someone in the sitting room, Ginny, probably, reading. The burrow below him going about being the burrow, unremarkable and extraordinary. He thought about what Ginny had said on Wednesday evening. We're invested in you specifically. The actual you. He thought about what Luna had said. You found something. He thought about what Hermione had said, the night before he went to see Xenophilius, when they'd been sitting at the kitchen table going through the access records and she'd looked up from the documents and said, completely without preamble, I want you to know that whatever happens with all of this, the most important part is that you're all right. The legal parts one can handle. The important part is you. He'd said I know and moved on because that was the easiest thing. He wanted, now, at altitude, to say it back more completely, to say that he knew it and that it had mattered and that the knowing of it was part of what had got him through the week without falling apart. That being known specifically, being cared about specifically, was a different experience from being loved in the general and symbolic sense he'd been offered for most of his life. That he was learning the difference, slowly, with all the imprecision and occasional backsliding of something actually learned rather than performed. He dropped lower. The field came up. He leveled off at about 20 feet and skimmed the top of the grass, the way he'd skimmed Hogwarts pitch in every practice, the old pleasure of speed and proximity, the way flying at low altitude had a different texture from flying high, more immediate, more responsive, the ground a specific thing rather than an abstraction. He slowed. He hovered for a moment. Below him the grass was still wet from last night's rain, catching the last light in individual drops, and the air smelled of the end of summer, that particular compound of cooling earth and late grass and the faint edge of something about to turn, the seasonal shift not yet visible but present in the air as a kind of intention. August ending. September coming. Harry thought about September. He thought about what came after, the Wisengamot hearing, the conclusion of the investigation, the articles and the coverage and whatever public narrative settled around the events of this week. He thought about the interview in The Prophet and the precedent in Crouch's prosecution and George's privacy product and Hermione's legal career and Ron's Auror application and Luna in her father's tower and Xenophilius writing honestly for the first time in a year. He thought about Wednesday at 2 o'clock, St. Mungo's third floor. He thought about all of it and found that the shape of it was good, not in the simple sense of things being resolved or completed, but in the sense of things being genuinely in motion in the right direction. Moving not because he'd pushed them but because the truth had a momentum of its own, when you stopped trying to manage it and just let it be what it was. He went back up. Not high, 50 feet, 60, the Burrow below him and the Devon countryside spread in every direction and the sky above in its full late August drama, the last of the gold against the deep blue, a star appearing in the east that was either a star or a planet and it didn't particularly matter which. He flew toward it anyway, or rather toward the general direction of it, which was the east and the dark and the night coming in, and then he turned back because the Burrow was lit and warm and Ginny was inside probably reading Quidditch World and Molly was cooking and the lights were on. He came down in the field in a long, clean descent, the broom leveling, the grass rising, his feet touching down lightly on the wet ground with the specific satisfaction of a good landing, which was its own complete small thing. He walked back to the garden gate. He could hear the Burrow from here, a snatch of conversation through the kitchen window, Molly's voice, something that might have been the wireless. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that had people in it who were continuing to be alive. He opened the gate and went in. The gate clicked shut behind him. He was halfway across the garden when the back door opened and Ginny appeared in the rectangle of kitchen light. She had a mug in each hand and she was wearing the old blue jumper she wore when she wasn't going anywhere and her hair was loose. She came down the back steps and across the garden toward him without hurry. She held out one of the mugs when she reached him. Tea. He took it. How was it? She said. Good, he said. Really good. She looked at his face and apparently found what she was looking for there, because she nodded and turned to stand beside him, looking at the garden in the dusk. He stood beside her. They were both holding their mugs, looking at the same stretch of wet garden and the darkening sky beyond the apple tree. 3 more prophet owls came while you were up, she said. Mum put them in the kitchen. I'll read them later, he said. Also Kingsley sent something. Hermione says it's confirmation of Thursday's Wisengamot date. Good. And someone from a wizarding privacy advocacy group, I'd never heard of them but Hermione has, apparently, wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at their autumn conference. He thought about this. Maybe, he said. I'll think about it. Also, she said, Arthur found an article in a 1987 back issue of the Quibbler from before Xenophilius ran it, when it was edited by someone else, and apparently in its original incarnation it was exclusively focused on Muggle technology and its potential magical equivalents, and Arthur has been in the sitting room for 2 hours reading it. Harry smiled at that. A real one. How happy is he? Unspeakably, she said. He laughed, a proper one, from somewhere below the sternum, unplanned. Ginny laughed too, briefly, and the sound of it went out into the garden and disappeared. When it faded, the quiet that settled was the good kind. The comfortable kind, full of everything that didn't need to be said. Harry held his mug and stood in the garden of the Burrow at the end of a week that had started with 50 owls at the kitchen window and his private history distributed across the wizarding world's breakfast tables, and thought about how it had moved, not from bad to good in a simple arc, but from exposed to intentional, from cornered to chosen. He'd started the week having something done to him. He was ending it doing something for himself. He'd start seeing Nakamura on Wednesday. He'd back George's privacy product. He'd let Ron and Hermione and Ginny and Luna see him. Actually see him, the real version, not the managed one, or at least, he'd keep trying to let them, because it didn't happen all at once, it happened incrementally, it happened each time you answered a question honestly instead of conveniently. He'd go to the Holyhead game in 3 weeks. He'd think about the advocacy conference. He'd figure out, slowly and without hurry, what being Harry Potter looked like when it was his own idea. "Ginny," he said. She said. "Thanks. For this week. For all of it." She looked at him sideways, with that expression, the one that was warm and direct and completely unimpressed by sentiment while being completely moved by it. "You did most of it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm still saying thanks." She bumped her shoulder against his, brief and deliberate. "You're welcome," she said. They stood in the garden a little longer. The stars were coming in properly now, the eastern sky gone full dark, the west still holding its thin last line of gold. A bat came out of somewhere near the apple tree and crossed the garden in its zigzag logic and disappeared back into the dark. The gnomes were invisible. The burrow's lights were warm through every window. Harry finished his tea. He looked up at the dark, open sky. Not running, not hiding. Not managing or performing or declining. Just standing in a garden he loved, under a sky that didn't need anything from him, fully and exactly himself. 3 weeks later, the Wiesengemot convicted Aldous Crouch on 4 of the 6 charges. He was sentenced to a substantial fine, 2 years of supervised restriction from public office, and mandatory community service within the very Department of Magical Health and Safety he had exploited. The judge noted for the record, at Marchbanks's specific request, that the conviction established a precedent in wizarding privacy law that had not previously been tested. The Magical Medical Privacy Act was formally reviewed and updated the following spring, largely through the advocacy of a young solicitor named Hermione Granger, whose reputation in institutional law grew quickly enough that within 2 years she was the most in-demand specialist in her field. Weasley's Wizard Safeguards launched in November to considerable demand. By the following spring it was the fastest-growing product line Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had ever produced. George was insufferable about it, in the good way. The Quibbler, under Xenophilius Lovegood's editorship and with significant input from Luna, published 12 issues in the following year. None of them were about political scandal. Most of them were about creatures. The subscription base grew slowly, and then less slowly, and the people who subscribed did so because they found the paper honest rather than because it was sensational. Luna came home to the tower the Saturday she'd promised. The conversation she had with her father lasted 4 hours. She did not report the contents of it to anyone, and no one asked. Ron Weasley's Auror application was accepted in October. He celebrated by making everyone at the Burrow a dinner of such ambitious architectural complexity that it took 3 hours and required a structural modification to the kitchen. It was excellent. Harry Potter attended the Holyhead Harpies season opener and sat in the standard seats, not the box, and watched Ginny Weasley play the best Quidditch she'd played since before the war. He went to see Healer Nakamura every Wednesday at 2. He stopped declining.